Picture a woman standing over an open coffin at 3 in the morning on a dirt road somewhere in the middle of Castile, holding a candle, staring at the face of her dead husband. Now picture that she's been doing this every night for 2 months. Add the smell, frankincense and lead, and something underneath both of those that no amount of incense can entirely, permanently, mercifully cover. Add the sound of monks chanting in the darkness behind her, 24 voices rising and falling in the cold Spanish night, because she pays them to sing over him always without stopping, even when she sleeps, even when she's not in the room, even when nobody's watching. Add the fact that outside the ring of candlelight the road stretches in both directions into black nothing, and the coffin sits on a cart in the mud, and the cart's wheels have sunk 4 inches into the earth, and her ladies in waiting are crying quietly at a distance they've calculated precisely. Close enough to be available, far enough not to be noticed. Add the fact that she is the Queen of Castile and Aragon, the rightful heir to one of the most powerful thrones in the known world. And add the fact that none of it matters. Not the crown, not the titles, not the bloodline that runs back through Isabella the Catholic and Ferdinand of Aragon, through generations of royalty so long and so tangled that half the courts of Europe are her relatives. None of it protects her from what is happening to her right now, in this moment on this road, with this candle, with this smell. That's Joanna, Juana la Loca, Joanna the Mad, called an embarrassment, called a burden, called a cautionary tale, filed away in the footnotes of history as the woman who loved too much, cracked under the weight of it, dragged a corpse across Spain, and had to be locked away for the good of everyone involved. We're going back there tonight, not as historians measuring her sanity against a clinical checklist, not as biographers cataloguing her symptoms, not as whatever generation of men decided that a grieving woman refusing to cooperate was the same as a broken one. We're living it. We're feeling the cold of that Castilian night through thin silk. We're breathing that incense. We're watching the faces of the people around us and learning, slowly and then all at once, that everyone you trusted has already decided what your future looks like, and they made that decision without consulting you, and there is nothing, absolutely nothing you can do about it. So I make these history stories, and the Joanna ones are the ones I find myself thinking about at odd hours, because here's the thing that keeps getting me. The corpse isn't the scary part. The corpse is just grief, taken past the point where polite society was comfortable with it. The scary part is everything that happened before the corpse. The years of being managed and monitored and gaslit by a husband who didn't particularly want her, by a father who wanted her throne, by advisors who wanted to be the power behind whichever royal was most conveniently incapacitated. The corpse, in a way, was the first free choice she'd made in years. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Get comfortable. Here we go. Your eyes open in a room you know by the weight of its darkness, not by sight. The curtains around the bed are heavy enough to block everything, the kind of a heavy that cost money, the kind that announces to anyone who enters that whoever sleeps here is someone whose sleep matters. The velvet smells of cedar and smoke, and underneath that, faintly, always faintly, the particular smell of a Spanish palace in late summer. Stone that has never fully dried, old wood, the ghost of incense from the chapel 2 floors below. For a moment you don't think about anything. There's a half second, maybe less, where you're just a body in warmth, and nothing has happened yet, and nothing is required of you. And then you remember, Philip is dead, not newly dead. He has been dead for 37 days now, which means you have woken up to this specific knowledge 37 times, and each morning the half second of forgetting gets slightly shorter, and the remembering gets slightly heavier, like something settling, like the way a stone wall settles over centuries. Not dramatically, not in a moment you can point to, just slowly and permanently, and without any interest in your feelings about it. You lie still and breathe. The air inside the curtains is warm and stale, faintly sweet with the smell of your own body, your hair, the rose water your ladies use when they help you dress. Outside the curtains you can hear the palace, the distant movement of servants, the murmur of voices in the corridor, dropped immediately when they get close to your door because everyone is very careful about noise around you now. Everyone is very careful about everything around you now. You reach out and touch the empty space beside you. The linen is cold and smooth. There's no dent in it. There hasn't been a dent in it for 37 mornings. This is how it starts, every day. This is the first thing. Before the ladies come in with water and clothes and careful expressions, before the chaplain sends word about the morning service, before your father's advisers arrange to have messages delivered that are phrased as concerns, but mean something else entirely. Before all of that, there is just this. Your hand on cold linen. The particular weight of understanding exactly what is missing. You're 26 years old. You're the Queen of Castile. You're the daughter of Isabella of Castile and Ferdinand of Aragon, the woman who funded Columbus and finished the Reconquista and reorganized the Spanish church and died 14 months ago, leaving you the most powerful piece on a chessboard you didn't ask to play. And you are lying in a palace in Burgos with your hand on cold linen, thinking about a man who was not always kind to you, who was frequently cruel to you, who humiliated you in ways that the court pretended not to notice, who in 10 years of marriage managed to be genuinely present for approximately none of it, and you cannot stop. That's the part nobody talks about. The part where loving someone difficult doesn't make the love smaller. The part where the grief isn't for the marriage you had, but for the marriage you kept trying to have. The one that was always one conversation away, one moment of patience away. The one that existed in the space between what Philip was and what he could have been. And that space just closed forever at 28 days into September of 1506. When your husband sat down after a game of polo, complained of a fever, and was dead inside 6 days. Get up. The command comes from nowhere and everywhere at once, from habit, from necessity, from the particular discipline of a woman who has been raised since birth, to understand that queens do not stay in bed. Queens perform. Queens are seen to be functioning, capable, present, appropriate. Queens do not sit in darkened rooms with their hands on cold linen, not if they want to keep being queens. You pull the curtain aside. The room is grey with early light coming through tall windows, the kind of thin, watery light that September in Castile does when it's trying to decide whether to become a real morning or just a pale suggestion of one. The stone floor is cold enough that you can feel it before your feet touch it. You sit on the edge of the bed and breathe the room's air, cedar, smoke, something faintly metallic, the smell of the iron candle holders, the particular mineral smell of old stone. Your ladies are already there. You don't know how they know. They always know. But Maria de Ulloa is by the window adjusting the curtain, and Isabel de Cuevas is near the door with a basin, and the youngest one, the girl from Valencia, whose name you can never quite remember in the mornings, is holding a robe and trying to look calm. None of them make eye contact. This is something that started happening about a week after Philip died. the not quite meeting your eyes, the slightly held breath when you speak, the tendency to position themselves near exits. They're afraid of you. Or not afraid exactly. Afraid is the wrong word. It's more like uncertain. Like they're not sure what you're going to do next, and in the absence of certainty, they've decided to be very still and very quiet and wait. You can't blame them. You're not entirely sure what you're going to do next either. "Good morning," you say, and your voice comes out steady, which surprises you slightly. "Good morning, Your Majesty," they say in that careful way, the way people say things when they've practiced saying them without inflection. The water in the basin is cold, almost shockingly cold, not icy, but cold enough that when you plunge your hands in and bring them to your face, the shock of it pulls you fully into the morning, into your body, into your actual skin. Your fingertips ache. Good. Aching is clear. Aching is real and present and asks nothing complicated of you. You dry your face on the linen cloth Maria holds out. The cloth is soft, softer than anything you owned before you were a princess, which is a strange thought to have at 6 a.m, but grief does this. It makes you notice the textures of things, the weight of cloth, the temperature of water, the exact way cold stone feels under the soles of your feet when you cross the room. Philip used to say you were too serious, too intense. He said this while laughing, usually, the way he said most things. Lightly, as though words were toys he could pick up and put down, as though nothing needed to be meant. He had a laugh that could fill a room without warming it. Beautiful, generous, effortless, and somehow always slightly beside the point. You thought for a long time that it was your fault, that if you could be lighter, easier, less yourself, he would stay. He would stop leaving for months without telling you where. He would stop allowing the court ladies to present themselves to his rooms at hours when you were supposed to be sleeping. He would look at you the way he looked at the women he was actually interested in, with that particular alertness, that forward lean, that smile that started in the eyes. You were 18 when you married him. He was 19. They brought you across the sea from Spain to Flanders in a ship that was blown off course 3 times by storms, and when you finally arrived at the harbour and they led you to the hall where he was waiting, you looked at him across the room and felt something happen in your chest that you had no prior experience with. He was the most beautiful man you'd ever seen. Not handsome in the careful way of portraits, genuinely beautiful, the way weather is beautiful, the way fire is beautiful, the way things are beautiful that have no particular interest in being looked at. He married you because your mother told him to. You were the heir. Marrying you was marrying Castile. You married him because you looked across a hall and something in your chest made a decision without consulting you. 10 years, 2 thrones, 6 children, 37 mornings of cold linen. Maria is dressing you now, her hands quick and practiced, doing up the complicated back of your dress with the efficiency of someone who has performed this task several hundred times. The fabric is heavy, silk and wool, appropriate morning black, stiff at the shoulders, smoother at the waist. You can feel the weight of it settling across your back. You stand very straight because the dress requires it. Queens stand straight because their clothes insist. Outside the window, Burgos is waking up. You can hear it even through stone walls 3 feet thick. The sounds of a city that doesn't know how to be quiet. The clatter of carts on cobblestones. The distant bell of a church. Someone shouting at someone else about something that matters enormously to them right now and will matter to no one by noon. Burgos in September. The air smells of old stone and early autumn, the particular smell of a Castilian city at the moment when summer releases its grip, and the wind off the plateau remembers it has work to do. Philip is in the church. That's where they put him after the doctors were finished, in the monastery of Santa Clara, in a lead coffin sealed against the smell, in the nave of the church where the monks pray over him in shifts because you requested it and no one yet has felt confident enough to deny you. The coffin is closed. You know it's closed. You closed it yourself 3 weeks ago, when the smell became impossible, when even the quantity of incense the monks were burning couldn't fully manage it. You closed it, and then you stood there for 2 hours and nobody touched you and nobody spoke, and eventually you walked out and the doors closed behind you, and you went back to your rooms and didn't sleep. The problem with a closed coffin is that it's just a box, and you've never been good with closed things. Your father's envoy arrives before breakfast. This is not technically unusual. Your father, Ferdinand of Aragon, has been sending envoys since the day after Philip died. A steady stream of concerned men in travel-stained coats who arrive with letters written in Ferdinand's careful, political handwriting, expressing grief, expressing support, expressing his deep paternal anxiety about your well-being. Every letter says approximately the same thing in a slightly different arrangement of words. You are grieving. This is understandable. But Castile needs its queen present, capable and governing. And given the extreme distress you have displayed, here the letters use careful, rounded language. Nothing sharp, nothing that could be quoted back as an insult. Given the strain of your circumstances, perhaps it would be wise to allow your father to assist in the management of the kingdom's affairs until you have recovered. Until you have recovered. As though grief is a fever, as though you will sweat it out if given enough time and enough management. The envoy's name is Mr&Mrs. You've seen him before, a careful, precise man with very clean hands, for someone who spends so much time on horseback, and eyes that do the thing you've noticed all of Ferdinand's people doing, the quick assessment, the catalogue, the little internal calculation that's always happening behind whatever expression they're presenting. He bows, you nod. He begins to speak. The usual opening, the expressions of sympathy. And you let him get 3 sentences in before you speak. My father wishes to govern Castile, you say. It's not a question. Mr&Mrs stops. Your Majesty, he says, your father has only the deepest concern for your... My father wishes to govern Castile, you say again. Same words, same tone. You watch him recalibrate. The kingdom requires stability, he says, which is the diplomatic version of yes. In times of transition, I am the Queen of Castile, you say. I am the transition. His expression doesn't change exactly, but something around his eyes tightens slightly. This is the part where, in a different kind of story, the young queen would be told she's being unreasonable, that she's not well, that the people who love her most are only trying to help. He doesn't quite say it, but you can feel the shape of it in the room, taking up space. My father may advise me, you say. He may not govern in my name. When you write to him, please make that distinction clear. You watch him decide whether to push further. He doesn't. He bows again very correctly and leaves. You turn to the window. Burgos below you, grey and awake, the cathedral tower rising above everything, the way cathedrals always do, as though height itself is a form of argument. Your hands are shaking slightly, which you don't let anyone see. He'll write to your father. Your father will write back. Another envoy will come. Or perhaps your father will come himself. He's been hovering at the edges of Castile since your mother died. Technically in Aragon, technically respecting the boundaries, but present in the way that large things are present when they want something from smaller things. You know what he wants. He's wanted it since Isabella died and the crown passed to you instead of to him. He was King of Castile in the sense that he was married to the Queen of Castile, which is a very different thing from actually being the king, a distinction your mother understood perfectly and maintained without drama for 30 years. Isabella knew exactly what she had. She didn't share it. She loved Ferdinand, probably. You've never been entirely sure. But she loved Castile more, or she understood that loving Castile was the job, and the job came first. You've tried your entire life to understand what your mother understood. The difference between you and Isabella is that she was raised for it. She fought for her throne before she inherited it. Years of civil war, of political manoeuvring, of being passed between men who wanted to control her, and learning, precisely and permanently, never to be controllable. By the time she was a woman, she was made of something that didn't bend. You were raised in her shadow, taught to pray, to embroider, to read Latin, to ride, to present yourself appropriately in court, taught the theory of being a queen. Not the practice. The practice was supposed to come later. It came all at once. You were in Flanders when your mother died. You were in Flanders when your brother Juan died before her. The original heir, the golden boy, gone at 19 from what the doctors called a wasting illness, and what everyone else called heartbreak over his young wife. Though hearts don't technically kill people that way, do they? Except sometimes they do. You were in Flanders when your sister Isabella died, and then her son Miguel, the one who was briefly heir to everything, Spain, Portugal, the whole package, died too. An infant, 2 years old. One by one, the people who were supposed to be between you and this crown died, and each death sent a message across the sea to Flanders, and each message arrived while you were managing a husband who didn't particularly want to be managed, and a court that didn't particularly like Spaniards, and a set of in-laws who were very interested in your inheritance but considerably less interested in you as a person. And eventually you ran out of siblings, and the message came that your mother was dying, and Philip didn't want to go back to Spain. It was inconvenient. It disrupted his plans. He had people to see. He had a particular lady at court who was interesting to him just now. And you had a conversation that you will never forget, and that he probably forgot before the week was out, about what it means to be a queen, and what it means to be a wife, and what happens when the two things pull in different directions. You went back to Spain. He followed eventually because the crown was there and the crown was the point, which you always knew, and which he confirmed without meaning to every time he chose it over you. But he followed, and for a while, a very short while, a matter of months, you almost had the thing you'd been trying to reach for 10 years. Philip in Castile, both of you ruling. The court finally having to take you seriously because there was nowhere else to look. You sat in council meetings and your opinions were sought. You signed documents. You made decisions about things that mattered. And then Philip sat down after a game of polo, complained of a fever, and was dead inside 6 days. The monastery of Santa Clara is a 20-minute walk from the palace. You make this walk every morning. Nobody tells you not to. Nobody tells you to either. It's simply what you do, in the same way that breathing is what you do. Not a decision, exactly. More like the absence of a decision to stop. The streets of Burgos move around you. A queen on a morning walk creates a particular kind of space. People stop and bow, and then, once you've passed, resume what they were doing, slightly elevated by having been near power for a moment. The cobblestones are uneven here, worn down the centre by centuries of cartwheels, and you've learned to walk slightly to the side where the stone is still roughly textured, where your feet find purchase more easily. You've learned the smell of Burgos too, the bread baking near the market, the horses, the river somewhere close, the particular bite of cold air off the meseta, the plateau that surrounds the city like a held breath. Your ladies walk behind you at the distance they've settled on. 6 of them this morning. Maria, always, the others rotating. The monastery's door is heavy oak bound with iron, and the doorman, an old man who has been performing this function since before you arrived, opens it without being asked. He bows. You pass through. Inside, the smell changes. Stone, old stone, the deep mineral smell of a building that has been here for 150 years and intends to be here for several hundred more. Incense, frankincense primarily, with something heavier underneath it. Myrrh, perhaps. The kind of incense that was designed for exactly this purpose, for managing the presence of death within a sacred space. And underneath that, underneath the frankincense and the myrrh and the cold stone air, something else. Something that the human nose recognizes before the human mind has quite formulated the category. Sweet and wrong in a way that bypasses thought entirely and goes directly to the oldest part of the brain, the part that has been running since before there were words for what it's detecting. 37 days. A lid coffin slows the process. It doesn't stop it. Nothing stops it. That's the thing. That's what nobody who has never been in a room with the dead for an extended period quite understands. That death is not a state, it's a process. And the process has a direction and a momentum that cannot be argued with, that does not respond to grief or love or denial or frankincense, or the prayers of 12 monks in a cold nave. But you're here anyway. The monks stop their chanting when you enter. You raise one hand, slightly, a small gesture, and they start again. Their voices fill the nave the way water fills a vessel, finding every corner, every height, settling into the architecture of the space. The coffin is on a bier in the centre of the nave, lead, dark grey, sealed at the joins with something that was supposed to be permanent, that mostly is. Draped in black velvet and the royal arms of Castile, the castle, the lion, embroidered in gold thread that catches the candlelight and makes the whole thing look, in the dimness of the church, like something out of a devotional painting, like something designed to be looked at. You pull a low stool from the side of the nave and sit, not kneeling, sitting. There's a distinction that matters to you and that you've stopped trying to explain to people. Kneeling is for God. Sitting is for staying. You sit with Philip for an hour. The monks chant, the candles burn, the incense coils up from the censers in thick, unhurried spirals. Your hands are in your lap still, your back straight the way the dress insists. If anyone looked in, and no one does, they've learned not to interrupt this hour, they would see a woman sitting very quietly in a cold church, which is not, by any reasonable definition, madness. What is happening inside is harder to describe. There's a particular kind of grief that attaches itself to things, to objects, to places, to the physical fact of someone's presence, not the person, exactly, not who they were, but the specific way they took up space, the way they smelled, the sound of their breathing when they were asleep in the same bed. When people die, what they leave is not a memory, but an absence shaped exactly like them. And every time you sit in this space, next to the lead-grey box that contains what remains of the most frustrating, the most beautiful, the most comprehensively unavailable person you have ever loved. What you are doing is sitting inside that absence and refusing to pretend it isn't there. Everyone wants you to pretend it isn't there. That's what recovery means in the language of courts. It means pretending. The monks chant. You sit. Later, you're never sure how much later, time moves differently in here. You become aware of someone entering the nave, not one of your ladies, someone heavier, slower, with the particular footfall of a man who is used to other people making way for him. You don't turn. Bishop Juan Rodriguez de Fonseca stops at a respectful distance behind you. You know who it is by the sound of his breathing, the slightly laboured quality of it, the way it has of filling silence like a comment. Your Majesty, he says. Bishop, a pause. Your father the king sends his respects. My father the king sends his envoys, you say. His respects are secondary. Another pause. The monks chant over both of you. Gloria in excelsis Deo. The voices winding around the cold stone columns and settling in the spaces above. The court has concerns, Fonseca says carefully, about the arrangements. The arrangements are appropriate for a king. The arrangements have been ongoing for 37 days, Your Majesty. He has been dead for 37 days, you say? The time should match. You can hear him formulating his next sentence. He's a careful man. Careful in the way that men who have spent their lives in courts are careful, which is to say he weighs every word before he releases it, and some words he decides to keep. He is not your enemy exactly. He is your father's instrument. There's a difference. And it's a difference Fonseca would probably appreciate you making. There are questions, he says, about the journey. Here it is. You've been waiting for this one. Philip's will. Or rather the plan you've formed. The plan that is entirely reasonable if anyone would stop performing concern for long enough to listen, is to take him south, to Granada, to the royal chapel there, where your mother Isabella is buried. They should be together. That's what Philip wanted, or rather what Philip would have wanted if Philip had ever considered his own death for long enough to form preferences about it, which he hadn't, because Philip was 28 and beautiful and entirely confident in his own permanence. But Granada is the right place. It's where the crown belongs. It's where you will be buried eventually and your children after you. I intend to transport my husband's remains to Granada, you say, as is appropriate. Your Majesty, Fonseca says, Granada is several weeks' journey, yes, I'm aware of the distance. The condition of the... He stops, reroutes. The logistical considerations of such a journey, given the current circumstances, I will handle the logistical considerations, you say. My husband will not be left here. There is a long silence. The monks have shifted key. Kyrie Ellison now, Lord have mercy. The 3 syllables falling and falling in the cold air. Your father, Fonseca says finally, believes that some period of rest, of recovery, before such an undertaking. My father, you say, is not the King of Castile. You stand. Fonseca takes a small step backward. Not quite a retreat, but a reassessment. You are not tall. You never have been. Shorter than Philip by almost a foot. Shorter than most of the men around you. A fact that the court has always used in its calculations. The way it uses everything. Looking for the angles that mean advantage. But there's something about the way you're standing now. Something about the quality of stillness that makes the adjustment in Fonseca's posture feel very much like a step backward. I will advise you, you say, as I advise all of my father's people, Castile has a queen, She is grieving. She is not absent. Fonseca bows. His face gives nothing away. He's too experienced for that. As your Majesty says, he says, and withdraws. You wait until his footsteps have faded entirely before you turn back to the coffin. 37 days, the monks chant. It wasn't always this. You need to understand that because everyone who tells Joanna's story wants to start with the coffin, which is the dramatic image, which is the thing that reads as madness from the outside, and starting there is how you get the wrong story. Starting there is how you get the cautionary tale instead of the actual woman. Start earlier. Start in Flanders. Start with a girl of 17 on a boat in the middle of the Bay of Biscay in a storm that has been going on for 4 days, the sea so violent that the sailors are praying, actually praying, on their knees on a wet deck. And you were, sitting in the cabin that was supposed to be comfortable, that is being thrown from side to side in a way that makes comfortable a complicated word, and what you were thinking about was not death, not the sea, not the storm. You were thinking about the man you were sailing toward. You'd been told about Philip of Burgundy. Everyone had been told about Philip of Burgundy, his beauty, his charm, his easy manner, the way he moved through rooms as though the rooms had been built specifically for him. He was the son of Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian I and Mary of Burgundy, which made him heir to vast territories in the Netherlands and Germany, and a great deal of political leverage besides. He was the right match for the daughter of Fernando and Isabella. Everyone agreed on that. What everyone agreed on, you learned later, had very little to do with who Philip actually was, because everyone who agreed on it was agreeing about what Philip represented, which is a different thing from agreeing about a person. The boat found Flanders eventually. Storms always end. And when the storm ended and the harbour came into view, you were standing on deck with your hair destroyed by 4 days of salt wind, and your best dress stuck to you in ways that were distinctly unprincess-like, and you were very deliberately not thinking about how you looked. They took you to the hall where Philip was waiting. And then the thing happened. The chest thing. The thing you didn't have a prior example of. He looked at you with that particular alertness. Forward, interested, genuinely curious, and said something in French that your translator began to render, and you interrupted because your French was actually good, and you didn't need the middleman. And something happened in his expression when he realized that. Something like surprise becoming something like interest, becoming something like recognition of an equal. You were married that same day. Neither of you could wait for the formal ceremony later, which was unusual, which was scandalous, which was also, you thought, the most honest thing that had happened in a very long time. 6 months later, Philip lost interest. Not dramatically, not all at once. More like the way light shifts at the end of an afternoon. Gradual, diffuse, and then suddenly you look up and notice the room is darker than you thought. He began travelling without telling you, spending nights elsewhere, presenting you at court functions with the particular courtesy of a man who has done something he knows is wrong and is compensating with excessive manners. You were 18, 19, 20, and you were in a country where you didn't know anyone, where the court was his court and spoke his language and had known him since he was a child, and the person you had crossed a stormy sea to find was systematically removing himself from the place where you could reach him. You cried, you raged. You said things you later regretted to people who wrote them down. That's what they used, eventually. Those moments, the crying, the raging, the time you locked yourself in a room for 3 days and refused to come out, the time you appeared at a court function without adequate attendance and in clothing that wasn't quite right, because your ladies had been dismissed at Philip's order, and you were 18 and alone in a foreign country and doing your best, which apparently wasn't the right best. Hysterical, the court said. Unstable. Jealous to the point of pathology. Philip wrote to her parents in Spain, to Ferdinand, to describe his wife's emotional excesses, to express concern, to suggest carefully that some of her behaviour gave cause for worry. Ferdinand wrote back, carefully, sympathetically. Both men understood what they were doing. Whether either of them ever admitted it, even privately, even to themselves, that you can't know. What you know is what you felt, which was not madness, not instability, jealousy, yes, rage, yes, grief, yes. The particular specific grief of watching someone you love decide slowly and then definitively that you are less interesting than the alternatives. Those are not symptoms, those are responses. They look identical from the outside, if you're the person deciding who gets to define what they mean. The preparation for the journey south begins on a Wednesday. Not officially. Nothing in Castile happens officially until Ferdinand agrees to it, which Ferdinand won't do because Ferdinand is still managing Joanna's grief from a distance of several hundred miles, still sending envoys, still writing careful letters. But you've spent your whole life in courts, and you know how things actually work, which is not through official channels, it works through Maria. Maria de Ulloa, your first lady, who has been with you since before Philip, who has the particular combination of loyalty and competence that you've learned is vanishingly rare. The kind of person who will do what you ask and also tell you honestly when what you're asking is a mistake, and who judges the difference between those two situations with a precision that impresses you almost daily. You tell Maria, one evening after supper, that you need carts and drivers and a route south that avoids the major roads where you're most likely to encounter your father's people, who will have been instructed to slow things down. Maria looks at you steadily. When? She says. 2 weeks, you say. Maybe 3. I need the monk's arrangement first. Someone who travels with him and maintains the offices. How many monks? You think about it. 12. Enough for continuous chanting. They'll need to take turns. Maria nods slowly, like someone who is internally cataloguing logistics and finding them difficult but not impossible. The court will talk, she says. The court talks already, you say. The court has talked since the day we arrived. Let them. She nods again, once. The kind of nod that means she's moving the objection from the main column to the side column, and will raise it again if it becomes urgent. The condition of the coffin, she says carefully. I know. In October, travelling south, the roads are muddy. If the cart... I know. You meet her eyes. I know what I'm asking. There's a pause. The candle between you bends in a draught from somewhere. I'll find the carts, Maria says. You discover around this time what it is to be a queen in practice. Your mother Isabella was famous for it. The practical queenship. The willingness to get on a horse and ride to a battle if that's what the battle required. There are stories about Isabella that have been smoothed into legend by the telling, the way all stories about powerful women get smoothed. But underneath the legend is a woman who genuinely did the work, who understood that crowns are maintained by competence and not by ceremony. You are competent. This is not something you've ever had occasion to prove because there was Philip, and before Philip there was Spain, and you were never in a position to do the work of a queen without someone immediately repositioning themselves between you and the work. Advisors, husbands, fathers, a steady succession of men convinced that the work required managing. But here is a thing about planning a funeral procession across several hundred miles of Spain in late autumn. It is enormously detailed work, and nobody else is doing it, and so you do it. You sit with maps and calculate distances. You write to the monasteries along the route. There are routes that work, routes that don't work, road conditions in October that require specific types of cartwheel, elevation changes that affect how long each day's travel can realistically take. You work out the monk's rotation, the incense supply, the candles, the velvet to cover the coffin in transit. Philip would have found this funny, probably, would have laughed at you measuring incense quantities against travel days. You can almost hear the laugh, the room-filling kind, the slightly beside-the-point kind. You keep working. Maria finds you at your desk at an hour past midnight, surrounded by papers, a candle burning very low. The carts are arranged, she says. 12 carts. Reliable men. 2 I know personally. Good. Also, she pauses, your father's man Cisneros has arrived in Burgos. Cisneros, Francisco Jimenez de Cisneros, Archbishop of Toledo, your mother's confessor and closest adviser, a man of genuinely formidable intelligence and genuinely formidable piety, the combination of which makes him more complicated than Fonseca, harder to read, more dangerous because he doesn't operate on purely political logic. Also, notably, the man your father sent to manage your mother in the last years of her illness, when Isabella was bedridden, and the court was quietly redistributing her authority. The man who knows, from personal experience, how to install a regency around a queen who technically still holds the title. You set down your pen. When did he arrive? This evening? Does he want an audience? He has written to request one tomorrow morning. You look at the papers in front of you, the route maps, the incense calculations. Tomorrow afternoon, you say. Tell him I'm occupied in the morning. Maria withdraws. You look at the guttering candle and think about Cisneros, who is not your enemy and is not your friend, who serves God and Aragon in that order or possibly simultaneously, who will walk into your audience chamber tomorrow and be entirely reasonable and entirely unmovable, and will conduct himself in a way that will look, to any outside observer, like concern. The thing about being a queen whose grief has been classified as madness by the people who have the most to gain from that classification is that everything you do gets read through that classification. When you cry, it's madness. When you stop crying, it's distressing detachment, also madness. When you assert your authority, it's an episode. When you're quiet, it's worrying withdrawal. The category once established is self-sealing. The candle goes out on its own in the middle of this thought. You sit in darkness for a moment, feeling the cold of the room, the weight of the dress you haven't bothered to change out of, the ache in your hands from hours of writing. The stone walls of Burgos press close. Outside, the city is quiet in the particular way cities are quiet at this hour. Not silent, but reduced. The daytime noise compressed into the occasional sound, a dog, a cart, a voice briefly raised and then gone. You get up in the dark, find the wall by memory, and make your way to the bed. You don't sleep for a long time. When you do, you dream about Flanders, about a harbour in winter light, and a hall full of people and a man across the room who looked at you with that forward, interested, genuinely curious look. Only in the dream you can't quite make out his face. Cisneros is shorter than you expected. You've met him before. You must have. He was a constant presence in your mother's court. But memory does strange things to powerful people, tends to scale them up. The actual Archbishop of Toledo, standing in your audience chamber in his plain grey habit, the one he's famous for wearing instead of the elaborate vestments his office entitles him to, is a narrow, spare man of about 70, with eyes like polished obsidian and the posture of someone who prays on a cold stone floor every morning and has never once considered that this might be excessive. He bows. You nod. "Your Majesty," he says. His voice is dry and precise like documents. "Archbishop." You don't offer him a seat. He doesn't seem to expect one. "Your father the king," he begins. "Send his respects," you say. "Yes, I've been informed." "He is concerned," Cisneros says, without adjusting for the interruption, which you respect slightly, "about the course of events in Castile, the question of governance in the immediate—" "I govern Castile," you say. "Yes," he pauses. "In practice, however, certain functions—" "I govern Castile," you say again. "When a specific function requires my attention that I have not yet addressed, you are welcome to raise it. In the meantime, I am governing." Cisneros looks at you with those obsidian eyes. He is, you realize, genuinely trying to assess you. Not performing the assessment, actually doing it. Taking the measure of who you are and what you're capable of, with the same directness and lack of sentiment he would bring to any other question of importance. You return the look. Something shifts very slightly in his expression. Not surprise exactly, more like revision. "The council met last week," he says, shifting ground, "to discuss the question of the—" "The council met without my authorization," you say. "That will not happen again." "Your Majesty was not available to—" "I am available now." You move to the desk where your papers are arranged and gesture at the chair across from it. "Sit down, Archbishop, let's discuss the council." He sits, and for the next 2 hours you conduct the meeting that your father's people thought they could avoid by calling a separate one. You discuss the grain situation in Andalusia. You discuss the border question with Portugal. You discuss the 3 judicial appointments that have been pending since before Philip died, which nobody has managed in the intervening weeks because nobody was quite sure who had the authority, and everybody was hoping that question would resolve itself through your father's intervention. You resolve it. Cisneros writes very quickly, making notes in a small book he produces from inside his habit. His handwriting, you can see from across the desk, is extremely small and extremely legible. When it's over, he closes the book and looks at you. "Your mother," he says without preamble, "was the most effective sovereign I served." "I know," you say. "She was not always comfortable," he says, "to work with. She was demanding, she was precise. She had very clear ideas about what she wanted and no interest in being managed." "I know," you say again. He looks at you for a long moment. "I will write to your father," he says, "that the situation in Castile appears to be in hand. This is not what your father sent him to write. You both know that." "That is the truth," you say, "so it seems appropriate." He stands, bows, a degree deeper than before, fractionally, almost imperceptibly, and leaves. You wait until the door closes. Then you put your head in your hands, not from grief, from exhaustion. The particular exhaustion of performing competence under surveillance, which is a different and more specific exhaustion than simply being competent. Maria appears from somewhere. She has a talent for this, for being in the room slightly before you need her. "Well," she says, "he'll write a balanced report," you say. "My father won't be satisfied." "But it buys time." "It buys time?" Time is currency here. You understand that now in a way you didn't before Philip died. When Philip was alive, time was a thing that happened around you, to you, through you. Years of waiting for a man to decide you were interesting enough to stay. Now time is a resource you're actively managing, buying in small increments. through meetings like the one that just happened, through the careful management of who gets access to you and when, through the planning of a journey that everyone wants to prevent but nobody quite has the authority to forbid, because you are the Queen, and that still has not been taken away. The night before the journey begins, you go to the church alone. Not entirely alone. Maria is there, and 2 guards at a distance, and the monks in their endless rotation. But alone in the sense that matters. No advisors, no envoys, no careful men with letters from Ferdinand. The nave is cold. October in Castile has arrived while you are making calculations, and the cold has come with it. The hard, dry cold of the plateau. A cold without moisture, a cold that settles into stone and stays. You can feel it through the soles of your shoes. The incense hangs in the air more heavily in the cold, or maybe it's just that the cold amplifies everything, sharpens the edges of sensation. You bring your stool and sit. The monks are singing the nocturnes, the night office, the prayers for the dead that Christianity has been singing in roughly this form for 1,000 years, the Latin rising and falling in the darkness of the nave while outside Burgos sleeps its cold October sleep. Miserere me, Deus, have mercy on me, God. The psalm filling the church the way Philip's laugh used to fill rooms without quite warming them. Here is a thing that people who are not religious sometimes miss about people who are. When Joanna sits next to a coffin in a cold church and has monks pray over it, she isn't performing. She isn't in denial. She knows perfectly well what's in the coffin. She knows what has happened to it and is happening to it and will continue to happen, regardless of incense or prayer or lead or the thickness of the stone walls. She's doing something that her century understood, and ours has largely lost the habit of. She's keeping company with the dead, treating death not as an ending that must be processed and moved past as quickly as possible, but as a transition that requires time, attendance, witness. Every Catholic in 1506 Spain would have understood this. The soul requires prayers. The body requires honour. The mourning process requires its proper duration. What made people uneasy wasn't that you were doing it. It's that you kept doing it, past the point where decorum suggested you should have transferred the responsibility to professionals, clergy, attendants, and returned to your proper function as a living queen with a kingdom to run. But here's the question that nobody wants to ask. What would stopping look like? Going back to your chambers, accepting that the coffin would remain here in Burgos while you were pressured in Granada or Tordesillas, or wherever your father decided you should be, while the monks were reduced in number and eventually disbanded, while Philip's remains became a bureaucratic inconvenience to be resolved through a committee. Sitting here is not the same as being unable to leave. Sitting here is a choice. It's a particularly expensive choice. It costs you the appearance of normalcy, the appearance of recovery, the appearance of someone who has accepted the way things are and moved appropriately forward. It costs you everything the court requires of a queen who wants to be taken seriously. You sit here anyway, because if you don't choose what to keep, they will choose what to take. The monks finish the nocturnes and begin the lauds. You listen to the transition, the shift in the music, the way the Latin prayers move from darkness towards something that is not quite light, but is oriented toward it. Tomorrow, the journey begins. You close your eyes. The morning of departure is chaos organised by Maria. You've learned that Maria's organisational chaos looks like ordinary chaos to anyone watching. The rapid back and forth, the sharp questions, the revised answers, but produces, if you trust it and don't interfere, results that are exactly right. 12 carts, 23 monks in 2 groups, rotating, your ladies, your guards, the supplies for the journey, which in October means more wood than you'd like, but there's nothing to be done about that. Candles, incense, the ecclesiastical equipment, the censers, the holy water, the vestments for the offices. And Philip. Moving a coffin, you've discovered, is not a simple matter. A lead coffin, sealed, contains approximately the weight of 2 large men. It requires, at minimum, 8 people to lift it without incident, and the technique matters. Even weight distribution, coordinated movement, someone calling the pace. The monks who have been here since the beginning, who've developed a particular relationship with this specific coffin and its specific weight, are the most experienced. They do it without being asked, without drama, with the focused care of people doing something they understand to be important. The coffin is placed in the lead cart. The lead cart has been modified, the bed reinforced, the sides raised to prevent shifting on uneven roads, the whole thing draped in black velvet that Maria acquired from somewhere at short notice, and that hangs correctly despite the wind that has come up this morning off the plateau. You stand and watch it all happen. A clerk from the council appears at your elbow, one of your father's residual people, placed in the court before Philip died and not yet removed, and begins to speak about the impropriety of, "Write it down," you say, without looking at him. "Whatever your objection is, write it down and I'll consider it." He stops. "Now," you say. He withdraws to find paper. He won't write it down. He'll write to Ferdinand instead. That's fine. You're used to having your decisions reported to Ferdinand. You're used to being a subject of ongoing correspondence between powerful men who aren't you, discussing what to do about you as though you were a weather problem. The convoy assembles in the monastery's outer courtyard. The monks arrange themselves around the led cart, 2 on each side, beginning the first office of the journey. The movement of sacred remains requires continuous prayer, and the prayer begins here, in the courtyard, before the gates open. You mount your horse. You are travelling with the convoy, which is not what courts expect of queens, which is not what your ladies expected, which caused a very long conversation last week about appropriate royal behaviour that you let run to its conclusion, and then said, "I am riding with my husband." They stopped arguing. The gates open. Burgos spreads before you in the pale, cold October morning, the cathedral tower catching the first real light of the day, the streets beginning their daily business. Carts, people, the bread sellers, the water carriers, they stop when they see you. The people on the street stop and stare, and then some of them kneel, and then some of them take off their hats, and some of the women cross themselves. Because the Queen is riding through Burgos at dawn, following a coffin draped in black velvet and royal arms, surrounded by monks chanting lauds in the morning air, what they see you will never entirely know. Some of them probably see madness, the Queen who won't let her husband go, the Queen who's been the subject of so much worried correspondence from so many concerned men. Some of them probably see grief, which is something they understand personally. Some of them probably see something they've never seen before and won't again, and so they just watch you ride. The first day is 18 miles. 18 miles in October on the roads of Castile is a full day's work for a convoy of this size. 12 carts, more than 40 people, horses that are fresh in the morning and considerably less so by midday. The roads are mostly packed earth, dry enough after the summer, but already showing the preliminary rutting that the winter rains will complete. The plateau stretches around you, flat and enormous. the kind of landscape that suggests the world is much larger than your immediate concerns. You ride alongside the leader cart, not behind it, not ceremonially in front of it, alongside, close enough to hear the creak of the wheels, the soft percussion of the monks chanting, the wind moving through the velvet draping. Maria rides on your other side. She doesn't talk unless you talk to her, which you've always valued. The capacity to be present without filling the silence with the noise of presence. The sun climbs. The cold of the morning becomes the relatively mild cold of midday, which in Castile in October is still cold enough that your breath shows and your fingers inside your riding gloves ache slightly when you've been holding the reins for a long time. You stretch them open against the leather, press them closed, stretch open, press closed. A small, constant motion, hands working against the cold. Around midday, one of the carts develops a wheel problem. A spoke cracked somewhere in the morning, not enough to cause immediate disaster, but enough that continuing risks it. The convoy stops. The drivers and the blacksmith, who Maria included in the party, examine the wheel with the focused attention of men who understand mechanical failure and its consequences. You dismount and walk. The road is empty in both directions, the plateau stretching to horizons you could see for 20 miles if the light were different. Dry grass at the road's edge, brown and flattened by wind. The occasional small stone. The mountains to the north, already beginning the process of looking like winter. A woman from one of the villages, there's a small cluster of buildings visible about half a mile back, has been watching the convoy since it stopped. She's old, or looks old, the way country people often look older than they are from the outdoor work, from the weather. She's carrying something in her apron. She approaches carefully, stops a respectful distance away, looks at you with the direct, assessing gaze of a country person who has learned to read situations quickly. Majestad, she says, which is technically correct. You're the queen, she's a subject, but she says it without ceremony, the way you'd say it to someone you were actually speaking to rather than performing for. Good afternoon, you say. She holds out what's in her apron. Bread. 2 round loaves, still warm, still smelling of the oven. For the road, she says. God keep you. You look at her, at the bread, at the plain fact of what she's offering. A woman who probably has limited bread, giving some of it, because a queen is passing through her landscape in mourning. Thank you, you say. You take the bread. Your hands around it feel the warmth through your gloves. She nods once, crosses herself at the direction of the coffin cart and walks back the way she came. You eat the bread on horseback when the convoy moves again, in the afternoon. It's good bread. Coarser than what you're served in palaces, denser, made from grain that wasn't sifted to remove every bit of roughness, which makes it more satisfying in the way that unrefined things sometimes are. You eat it without ceremony, tearing it against the saddle. Maria accepts a piece when you offer it. Neither of you says anything about it. The sun moves west. The convoy moves south. At the monastery where you spend the first night, a Benedictine house, forewarned, prepared. The abbot clearly anxious, but managing his anxiety well. The coffin is unloaded with the same careful coordination as the morning and installed in the chapel. The monks resume their rotation immediately. The offices have been continuous since Burgos. You check this specifically at intervals, not from suspicion exactly, but from the same impulse that makes you count the candlesticks, that makes you verify the incense is burning, that makes you stand in the chapel doorway and listen for the sound of voices, the reassurance that the praying is happening, that the steady accompaniment of the sacred continues. It does. You sit in the chapel for an hour. The Benedictine monks add their voices to your Castilian monks, a slight difference in the way they shape the Latin, regional variations you're not quite expert enough to name but can hear. The chapel is smaller than Santa Clara, closer, the stone less refined, the smell of incense more concentrated. Underneath it, tonight, faint enough that you have to be paying attention to catch it, the smell. You are paying attention. You have been paying attention to this for weeks now, the way you track a sound in the distance to determine if it's getting louder or quieter. The lead seals were good, are good still. The smell is still a whisper rather than a presence. It will become a presence eventually. You know this. You have known this from the beginning, from the moment you watched the doctors seal the coffin, and understood, with the clarity that grief sometimes produces, that the seal was not permanent, and the process was not stopped, and that what you were doing was marking time. But time is what you have to mark. You go to sleep in a cell the abbot has offered, a small room with a narrow bed and a candle and a crucifix on the wall. The bed is hard, the blanket is rough wool. You pull it up to your chin and lie in the dark and listen to the distant sound of the monks chanting through 2 stone walls and a courtyard. The sound is thin from here, barely audible, but it's there. You sleep, not easily, but you sleep. The second week of the journey is when your father's people make their next move. You've been expecting something. The careful monitoring of your progress, the reports sent north, the question of what Ferdinand will do now that you're actually moving and not just threatening to. He's been in Aragon, technically respecting the boundary between his kingdom and yours, but Aragon and Castile are separated by a line that your parents drew together, and Ferdinand has never found that line entirely convincing. The message comes through a courier to the monastery where you spend the 8th night. A letter in Ferdinand's handwriting, which you recognize as well as you recognize your own. She was your mother. His was the hand you watched form documents for 20 years. The careful, pressured strokes of a man who writes, as though every word is a negotiation. He's coming to meet you, to assist with the journey, to offer his support and presence in this difficult time. You read the letter 3 times. Maria, sitting across the fire from you, watches your face. He's coming, you say. Yes. He intends to travel with the convoy, almost certainly. You put the letter down. If he travels with the convoy, you say, he will make decisions about where we stop, about how long we travel each day, about when we arrive and where. Yes, Maria says, he will be managing the journey. He will attempt to. You look at the fire. The logs in the monastery's hearth are ancient and dense, burning slowly, the kind of fire that produces heat more than light, filling the room with a warmth that feels earned. How far are we from the royal chapel at Granada, you ask? Perhaps 3 weeks, Maria says, at our current pace, given the roads. And at a faster pace, she considers. 2 weeks, possibly less if we push the horses and travel some nights. Can the convoy manage night travel? With enough torches, a pause. The monks won't object. They pray through the night anyway. You look at the letter from Ferdinand. The thing is, Ferdinand is not entirely wrong, in a practical sense. A woman travelling with a funeral convoy, sleeping in monasteries, making 18 miles a day across the Castilian plateau. This is not the optimal way to govern a kingdom. You know that. You are not unaware that there are documents in Burgos that need your signature, that there are disputes waiting for your judgment, that the machinery of Castile requires its queen in a way that cannot be fully managed by letters sent from the road. You know all of this. What Ferdinand doesn't know, what Ferdinand has never understood, despite having lived his entire life in proximity to women he consistently underestimated, is that you know it, and you're choosing this anyway. And the choice is not evidence of incapacity, but of priority, and the priority is reasonable. And what is happening to you is not what it looks like from a distance. What it looks like from a distance is a grieving woman dragging a corpse across Spain. What it is from inside it is a queen escorting her husband's remains to their proper resting place, keeping the promises that the living make to the dead, because those promises matter. Because if the promises don't matter, then nothing about the elaborate ceremony of monarchy means anything either. And if that's the case, then everyone in this century and the last several before it has been participating in a very expensive fiction. Also, if you arrive in Granada first, if you install Philip's remains in the royal chapel before Ferdinand can redirect the process, then the question of where Philip is buried is settled, and settled things are harder to unsettle than things still in transit. Ferdinand understands geography. He understands that a thing in motion can be redirected. A thing arrived cannot be unburied. We leave tomorrow before dawn, you say. Maria nods without surprise. Send word to the abbot. We'll need the coffin loaded in darkness. Done. And the monks? They'll be ready. You fold Ferdinand's letter and set it on the table near the fire, carefully, not in the flames. You might need it later, as a record of what was written and when. Maria. Majesty. Thank you. She makes a small gesture, not dismissive, just precise. She doesn't need to be thanked for doing what she does. Both of you know that. The pre-dawn loading is conducted in near silence. The monastery's torches throwing uncertain shadows on the courtyard walls, the monks moving with a particular quietude of people, accustomed to being active before other people are awake. The coffin comes down the chapel steps with the steady, careful coordination you've watched a dozen times now. The 8 men in their practiced arrangement, the controlled transfer to the cart, the velvet adjusted and smoothed in the torchlight. You're on horseback before the first grey suggestion of dawn shows on the eastern plateau. The convoy moves. The sound of the monks' chanting rises into the dark air, mixing with the hoofbeats, the cartwheels, the wind off the plateau, torches at the front and back of the convoy. Enough light to see the road, barely. You ride. This is the night when something shifts. You're not sure of the exact moment, it's dark, you're tired. The rhythmic motion of the horse and the rhythm of the monks chanting have created a kind of hypnotic continuity. But somewhere in the middle of this cold night, on a road in Castile between 2 monasteries, you stop thinking about Ferdinand and Cisneros and the council and the letters, and you think instead about Flanders, about a harbour in winter light, about what you brought with you from Spain in 1496 when you crossed the Bay of Biscay in a storm, not the trunks of clothing and jewellery that the court required, not the letters of introduction and political documentation, but the things that don't get put on lists. The Spanish prayers you'd been saying since childhood, the particular smell of Castile, dry, mineral, the smell of the plateau in summer heat, the way your mother's voice sounded when she prayed, which was very quiet, more quiet than most people expected, as though prayer was something intimate between herself and God and didn't require demonstration. You brought those things. You carried them across the sea and into a court that didn't quite know what to do with you, and into a marriage that didn't quite know how to be a marriage, and across 10 years of trying and failing and trying again. You kept them. The prayer, the smell of Castile that you can only remember from home now that you're in it again, your mother's quiet voice. These are things nobody took from you, though they took a great deal. You ride through the dark toward Granada, and somewhere behind you, Ferdinand is probably already being woken with the news that the convoy left before dawn, and he is probably making calculations, and those calculations are probably not in your favour. But the road is here. The monks are chanting. The hooves find the packed earth in the darkness with the reliable certainty of horses that know their job. Forward, south, toward the place where queens are buried. Forward. That's enough for now. Forward is enough. The moment everything breaks happens in broad daylight on a road between Aranda de Duero and Torquemada. In the second week of the journey, on a day when the sky is the brilliant hard blue of late October in Castile, and the light has that quality of absolute clarity that the plateau produces sometimes, where everything looks like it's been cut with a very precise knife. You hear the riders before you see them, a large group from the north, moving fast. The sound of many hooves on the packed earth is distinctive, different from your convoy's steady rhythm, more urgent, the particular percussion of horses ridden with purpose rather than paced for a long journey. You bring your horse to a stop. The convoy slows behind you. The riders appear around a curve in the road, 20 men at minimum, well mounted, and in front of them, dressed for travel but unmistakably, unmissably, Ferdinand. Your father, King of Aragon, 63 years old, compact and weathered, and arriving with 20 men on fast horses to intercept a funeral procession in the middle of a road. He pulls up his horse at a distance of 30 feet. You look at each other. Ferdinand is a man you've spent your entire life trying to read and mostly failing. Not because he's unintelligible. He is in fact very clear about what he wants. But because his face and his intentions have a complex relationship that he's had 60 years to perfect. He looks at you now with an expression that contains concern, affection, grief, and authority in proportions that are very carefully balanced. Joanna, he says, father. He looks at the convoy, at the black-draped cart, at the monks arranged around it, who've not stopped chanting and show no signs of doing so. Something crosses his face, not quite discomfort, something more specific, the expression of a man encountering a situation that is not developing in the direction he planned. He dismounts, his men follow, he walks toward you. This is not, he begins. My husband is being transported to Granada, you say, as is appropriate for a king of Castile. Joanna. His voice is the voice he uses for things he considers too important for normal conversation. Lower, quieter. You are not well. I am entirely well, you say. The court, you say, is in Burgos waiting for its queen. I'll be there when I've fulfilled my obligation to my husband. In the meantime, you're welcome to ride with us. A pause. He looks at you with those eyes, Ferdinand's eyes, the eyes that your mother once described in a private letter that you weren't supposed to read but did, as the eyes of a man who has never entirely stopped negotiating even when he's sleeping. Brown, sharp, taking in everything and releasing very little. You are my daughter, he says. I am the Queen of Castile, you say. Which you may recall is a different thing, since my mother was quite clear about that distinction. The monks continue to chant. The wind moves across the plateau. Your father stands on a road in the brilliant October light and looks at the woman his daughter has become, and you can see him deciding, not whether he will eventually win this. He is Ferdinand of Aragon, he believes, not unreasonably, that he eventually wins most things. But the immediate tactical question, whether to make the confrontation now, here, on this road, in front of 20 of his men and 40 of your people, and the monks singing their relentless prayers. "I will ride with the convoy," he says finally. "You're welcome," you say. You turn your horse to face south. The convoy moves. Ferdinand rides beside you, and neither of you speak for a long time, and the monks chant between you both like a third presence, like something that has its own opinions and is quietly expressing them in a language older than either of your kingdoms. He takes control gradually. It's very skillfully done. You'll grant him that. Your father has never been a man who needs to make things obvious. Control for Ferdinand is like water. It finds the lowest point, it fills the available space, and by the time you notice it's everywhere, rerouting it is a very complicated project. He doesn't change the route, not directly. He suggests a stop at a village that happens to be slightly northeast of the direct path. He recommends a monastery that happens to be in a position that, if you spend an extra 2 days there, will require a different road south. A road that, you notice on the map Maria shows you one evening, passes within 12 miles of Tordesillas. Tordesillas. You know Tordesillas. Everyone in Castile knows Tordesillas. A small town on the Duero River, between Burgos and Salamanca, notable primarily for the treaty your parents signed there in 1494 dividing the New World between Spain and Portugal, and for the Palace of Santa Clara, which is precisely the kind of establishment where a queen might be installed if the people responsible for her management decided that Granada was too far and too permanent and too definitive. You look at the map, you look at the proposed route, you look at Ferdinand, who is across the room discussing something with his secretary and not looking at you. "We continue on the direct road," you tell Maria that night. "He'll object," Maria says. "He'll object," you agree. "We continue." But you are watching now, watching the small adjustments. The way the conversation about tomorrow's route starts happening between Ferdinand's men and your men without being routed through you. The way the abbot of the monastery you're currently staying in has been spoken to by Ferdinand's secretary. You can tell by the way the abbot looks at you now, slightly differently, with a new carefulness, a new assessment. The web is being woven. You're watching it happen. And here is the truth that keeps you awake on the hard monastery bed that night, staring at the ceiling while Maria sleeps in the outer room and the monks chant somewhere below. You cannot stop it. Not entirely. You can delay it. You can refuse specific things, draw specific lines, make the web cost something to weave. But you are one woman with 40 people, and your father has 20 men here and considerably more elsewhere. And the court that you need to govern is in Burgos, being managed by people your father placed there, and the council that should be supporting you has been receiving letters from Ferdinand for 2 months. The coffin is the one thing you have. As long as Philip is in that cart, as long as the convoy is moving, as long as you are physically present and not confined somewhere, you have something to bargain with. The right to determine where your husband is buried is a queen's right, a wife's right, a right that no one has yet felt comfortable enough to take from you directly. They'll need to take it directly, eventually. But directly is harder. Directly requires someone to say, "You do not have this authority." And the person who says that is the person who has established that the Queen of Castile does not have authority. Nobody has quite been willing to say it out loud. Not yet. You close your eyes. Not to sleep. To think, which you do better in darkness, always have. The thinking that happens in darkness has a different quality from the thinking that happens in light. Less watched, less curated, less concerned with how it appears. Here's what you think. You think about your mother, who was locked in a tower in Segovia when she was 17 years old, placed there by her brother King Enrique, who was worried about what she represented as the legitimate heir to Castile. She was there for years, mostly. Came out sometimes, carefully managed, carefully supervised. And then the situation changed, and she came out entirely, and she spent the next 30 years making absolutely certain that no one would ever lock her away again. Isabella of Castile, your mother, the woman who funded Columbus and finished the Reconquista, and reorganized the church and died, having never in 30 years of rule relinquished a single ounce of authority she didn't choose to give. She was also the woman who signed the order that placed Joanna in Flanders, who received the letters from Philip describing her daughter's emotional excesses, who, in her final years, signed certain documents that made Ferdinand's regency somewhat more straightforward in the event that Joanna could not govern. She was also the woman who burned heretics, who expelled the Jews from Spain, who made decisions you will spend your entire life trying to understand. Your mother was not simple. Your mother was never simple. In the darkness of the monastery cell you find, against your expectations, that you are not afraid. Not of Ferdinand, not of Tordesillas, not of whatever comes next. You are tired. You are grieving. You are fighting a set of forces that are bigger than you and better positioned and have more patience than most, because men with kingdoms have the luxury of patience in ways that individual women don't. But you're not afraid. You're the daughter of Isabella of Castile. You crossed the Bay of Biscay in a storm when you were 17. You watched your siblings die one by one and accepted the weight of a crown you never asked for. You loved a man who didn't love you back properly, and you kept loving him anyway, which is its own kind of stubbornness, its own kind of refusal to let the world tell you what to feel. Grief is not madness. Grief is what it looks like when love has nowhere left to go. The convoy arrives at Tordesillas in early November. You know it's happening before anyone tells you directly. The route has been adjusted, not dramatically, not in a way that forced a direct confrontation, but adjusted day by day, small suggestions, small accommodations, until the road you're on is the road that leads to Tordesillas and not now to Granada. Ferdinand rides beside you when the town appears. It's a pretty town, you'll give it that. The Duero running through it, the November light on the water, the towers of the Santa Clara convent rising above the rooftops with the calm assurance of buildings that have no plans to move. Pretty in the particular muted way of Castilian November. Not lush, not green, but clear and still and occupying its space with complete conviction. The convent of Santa Clara, Ferdinand says, gesturing. They have excellent facilities. The sisters will ensure proper care of the... No, you say. Silence. Joanna, I will not be installed at Tordesillas, you say. I am the Queen of Castile and I am on my way to Granada. A pause. And then Ferdinand does the thing you've been watching him not quite do for 2 weeks. He stops managing and says the thing directly. The council has voted, he says. Your father acts as regent in your name, for the health and stability of the kingdom. There it is. Which council, you say very quietly. The Council of Castile. Who convened without my authority? In your... He stops. Given your circumstances. You look at the town, the river, the convent towers. And if I continue south, you say? He's quiet. Around you, the convoy has stopped. The monks are still chanting. They have not, through any of this, stopped chanting, and something about that consistency is the most solid thing in the world right now. those steady voices. Then, Ferdinand says finally, I will be compelled to take more direct measures. More direct measures. You understand what he means. He means men. He means the 20 he brought and however many more are positioned somewhere nearby. He means the thing that nobody has yet said, but that has been in every letter, in every careful envoy, in every managed conversation for 2 months. He means force. You look at your father, he looks back at you, and in his eyes, underneath the calculation and the politics and the decades of experience, you see something that might be regret. Might be. Ferdinand's regret is a complicated thing, layered over with necessity and justified by arguments that he probably believes. But it's there. A flicker. Philip goes to Granada, you say. Yes, Ferdinand says. Eventually. The remains will be transported when Philip goes to Granada now, you say. I will stay at Tordesillas if the council requires it, but Philip goes to Granada. Another silence. This is the negotiation. This is the thing you have left to bargain with. The only concrete thing, the one ask that is also the last ask. You give him Tordesillas, the regency, the management, the containment of the inconvenient queen, and he gives Philip Granada. You watch your father decide. The remains, he says finally, will be transported to the royal chapel in Granada. I give you my word. His word. Ferdinand's word is a document with fine print. You know this. You know that his word is worth approximately what the circumstances require it to be worth, and that circumstances change, and that the fine print is there precisely for the moments when circumstances change. He will keep his word in its strictest technical sense, and find ways to make it mean something different from what you heard. But it's what you have. Then I will go to Tordesillas, you say. The convoy enters the town. The convent of Santa Clara is larger than you expected and smaller than you feared. Thick stone walls built for the ages, built in the way that Spanish religious architecture is built. Against time, against weather, against the possibility of anything actually changing in any fundamental way. Clean, cold. The sisters line the walkway as you dismount, their faces arranged in expressions of welcome that are also unmistakably expressions of prepared patience. They've been told you're coming. Maria rides beside you until the gate, and then she stops. You look at her. I'll find accommodation in the town, she says. Not inside. Not inside. A pause. He didn't want me inside, she says, which means Ferdinand. You look at her for a long moment. Maria de Ulloa, who's been beside you since before Flanders, who organised the convoy and found the carts and argued and advised and served and given you, across these years, the single most consistent human presence in your life. I'll write, you say. I know, she says. She doesn't move, just sits on her horse and watches as you turn and walk through the gate. The gate closes. You stand in the convent courtyard and breathe. Stone, cold November air, incense from the chapel, the smell of the river close by. The sisters behind you, the sisters who are very kind and very competent and who are also absolutely certain what their role here is, to attend you, to care for you, to ensure that you remain attended and cared for, which in practice means remaining here. Philip's cart stands in the courtyard. You walk to it, put your hand on the velvet. The cold of the November air has gotten into the fabric. It's like touching stone. They'll take you to Granada, you say, quietly, to nobody in particular, to everyone. The monks are still chanting somewhere behind you. You stand with your hand on the coffin and breathe and do not cry, because crying right now would be the wrong kind of thing. would be the thing that everyone watching has been waiting for, would be the confirmation of every concern that has been expressed in every careful letter for 2 months. You just breathe. The stone of the courtyard is cold under your feet. The November light is failing now, the short day sliding toward evening, the brilliant plateau sky turning the particular deep blue of autumn dusk. Birds are moving somewhere overhead, too high to identify, passing through on the way somewhere warmer. You go inside. The years at Tordesillas are not what anyone expects, not what Ferdinand expects, who expects a compliant ghost of a queen, someone who can be managed into signatures and silence, a name on documents, and a problem neatly contained. Not what the historians who will write about her expect, who are mostly working from accounts written by the people who imprisoned her. Not what the popular imagination, which gets to Joanna la Loca through the paintings and the opera and the word mad, with all its implications, expects. Here is what happens at Tordesillas. You govern Castile, not officially, not in the public, visible way that Ferdinand's regency has claimed for itself, but in the way that you've always had to govern, through the spaces that official power doesn't quite close off, through the letters that still require your signature to be truly valid, through the people who come to Tordesillas specifically to reach you because Ferdinand's councils are producing decisions they don't trust. The sisters learn quickly that you are not a woman who sits still. You are up before lords and you want paper, and you want news. Real news. Not the curated news your father's people try to feed you, but actual information about what is happening in Castile, what the weather is like in Andalusia, how the harvest went, whether the dispute in Salamanca between the cathedral chapter and the university has been resolved, or is still producing letters. It still produces letters. The world does not pause because you are at Tordesillas. There's a girl who comes to help the sisters with their garden. 12 years old from the town, with hair the colour of winter grass and the particular directness of children who haven't yet learned to perform in direction. She slips you letters from Maria. She's been doing this since the 3rd week, and she has never once been caught. And you don't know if that's because she's genuinely good at it, or because someone in the convent has decided not to look too closely. But either way it works. The letters from Maria contain information. What Ferdinand is doing, what the council is saying, who is coming to visit and with what agenda. Practical matters of governance that arrive at Tordesillas by means Maria has organised, and that Ferdinand doesn't know about yet, or knows about and hasn't quite decided how to stop. You read the letters, you write responses, the girl takes them back, you also pray. This is important and also the thing that posterity will misread most completely. You pray a great deal at Tordesillas, and posterity, which is secular in its framing and somewhat suspicious of intensity, will read the prayers as evidence of instability, of religious obsession, of a woman whose grip on reality has been replaced by devotion to the irrational. What is actually happening is simpler. Prayer, for you, has always been what thinking is for other people. The place where you go to process, to reason, to be honest in a context where honesty is safe because God already knows what you're thinking and is not going to write it down and send it to Ferdinand. You pray about Philip still. You are honest about Philip in your prayers in a way you couldn't be anywhere else. About what you loved, about what you couldn't forgive, about the particular, specific injustice of a man dying before he understood what he'd done. Which means the accounting can never be closed, the conversation can never happen, the thing you needed to say will remain unsaid forever, and there is nothing on earth or in heaven that will change that. You pray about your mother, about Isabella, whose life was the map you were supposed to follow, and whose map was drawn for a different country. You pray about the choices she made and the choices she didn't make, and the letter you found after she died, in her private papers, with your name on the outside, which said only, "Be harder, be more, you're working on it," you think. Philip's body goes to Granada. Ferdinand keeps his word on that, or the literal part of it. The coffin is transported south and installed in the royal chapel, alongside Isabella, in the place that was always right. Your daughter Catherine, 11 years old, accompanies the cortege. You're not permitted to. You sit with this for a long time, then you go back to work. The years pass. Ferdinand dies in 1516. You are 36 years old, and the regent is gone, and the question of what happens now has no clean answer, because your son Charles has been in Flanders his whole life. He was born there, raised there, Flemish in culture and in language, a stranger to the country he's about to inherit, and the Castilian court is looking at the prospect of another foreign king with not entirely unreserved enthusiasm. Your son comes to Tordesillas. This is the meeting that you've been thinking about in various ways for 15 years. Your firstborn, the boy who was at Flanders while you were in Spain, who was with his Flemish grandmother while you were in Burgos, and then in the monastery, and then here, who is now 16 years old and about to be Charles I of Spain and Charles V of the Holy Roman Empire, and one of the most powerful men on earth. He is also your son. He comes in, and he is unexpected, not what you prepared for. He is tall, which surprises you. He has Philip's colouring, but nothing of Philip's ease. He's serious in a way that seems constitutive rather than performed. Seriousness as the basic condition of his existence, not something he puts on. He looks at you with Philip's eyes. The room tips slightly for a moment. Just a moment. Then it straightens. "Mother," he says in accented Castilian. The accent of a man who learned the language carefully but didn't grow up in it. "Charles," you say. He sits across from you, and you have the conversation that should have happened 15 years ago, about what you know and what he doesn't, about Castile and its people and its rhythms, about the men on the council who can be trusted and the men who cannot, about the particular way that Castilian loyalty works, which is not the same as Flemish loyalty, and is also not the same as Austrian loyalty, and he needs to understand this before he tries to govern. He listens. You're not sure what he expected. Probably what everyone expects. The broken woman, the mad queen, the mother who travelled with a corpse and had to be managed for everyone's safety. He has been told a story about you for 16 years by the people who had access to him, which means Ferdinand's people first, and then Flemish tutors, and then the court that surrounded him in Brussels. The woman across from him is not that story. She is thin. She is older than she should look, probably, from years in a stone building that is perpetually 10 degrees colder than anywhere anyone would voluntarily choose to live. She speaks with precision and economy, each sentence containing exactly what it needs to and no more. She also knows things about Castile that Charles does not know, things he needs, the kind of specific practical knowledge that you only have if you've been paying attention to a country for 30 years, which she has, which the regents haven't needed to, because knowledge of the kingdom was not their job in the way it was hers. After the conversation, he's quiet for a moment. "You should have been governing," he says finally. "Yes," you say. He looks at the window, at the river below, the Duero running cold in the autumn light. "Back at you. I can," he sobs. "No," you say. Because you know where that sentence ends, and you know that wherever it ends, what follows is more complicated than either of you can manage right now. I will stay at Tordesillas. The court is not prepared for what reversing this would require. You don't want what I want, you say, is not the primary consideration. You watch his face. That is something you will need to understand, Charles. The crown is not about what you want. It is about what the kingdom requires. Your mother's words, nearly exactly. He nods, slowly, seriously, taking it in. I'll come again, he says. Yes, you say. You should. He does come again. Not as often as he should. He has an empire, several wars, the whole machinery of the largest single political entity in the Christian world to manage. But he comes. And when he comes, he listens. And when problems in Castile don't yield to his counsel's solutions, he comes and asks his mother, who is at Tordesillas, who has been at Tordesillas for years now, who has never stopped paying attention. You're there when the Comuneros revolt breaks out in 1520, the revolt of the Castilian towns against Charles's Flemish advisers, against a foreign king who doesn't speak their language, against exactly the thing you warned about in the conversation when he first came. The rebels come to Tordesillas. They come specifically to you, because Joanna of Castile is still technically the queen, because her signature would legitimize their revolt, because a document signed by Joanna changes everything. They come to the gate. The leader is a man named Padilla, earnest and fiery, the kind of young idealist who will be dead in 2 years but doesn't know it yet. He explains, with great feeling and considerable oratory, what has gone wrong with the kingdom and what they intend to do about it, and how your signature, your participation, your emergence from Tordesillas would change the course of everything. You listen to all of it. Then you say, no. Not because you support Charles over the Comuneros in some abstract political calculation, because you understand what a civil war looks like, and you've spent 40 years learning that the thing which looks like victory often isn't, and because the men who come to you in revolt are the same men who will turn you into a symbol and then discard you when the symbol is no longer useful, and you are done being symbols for other people's causes. They leave. The revolt fails. Padilla dies. Castile remains, more or less, in Charles's hands, and you stay at Tordesillas. The years get longer and shorter simultaneously, which is the particular temporal distortion of a life lived within fixed walls. Long in the days, the cold days, the days when the Duero is grey and flat and the sky presses down on the plateau like a lid, and short in the decades. You look up and it's 1525, and look up again and it's 1540, and the world outside has done enormous things while you've been doing the slower, quieter thing of continuing to exist. Charles fights the French, he fights the Turks, he fights the Pope, he fights practically everyone, in the manner of men who inherit so much power that they can't quite work out who to give it to. He sends letters when he can. He comes when he can. Your daughters grow up. Catherine, who accompanied Philip's coffin to Granada, marries the King of Portugal. Maria marries the Emperor Ferdinand. They visit, less than you'd like, more than you sometimes expect. Your body changes, the way bodies change when they're not moving much, and when they are cold, and when the specific nutritional constraints of a convent table have replaced the variety of a royal kitchen. Your hands, which were once your most reliable physical fact, the hands that held reins and signed documents and touched the velvet of a coffin on a road in Castile, develop a tremor in the late years, small, not always there, but there. You look at the tremor and think, here is where I am. You're not sure in these later years how much of what you remember is accurate, and how much has been worked on by time, the way stone is worked on by water. The early years in Flanders are clear, too clear almost, with that false brightness of distant memory. Philip is harder, not the face which stays, but the details, the specific quality of his presence. You're not sure whether you are remembering him or remembering the memory, which is its own thing with its own distortions. The corpse, the convoy, the monks, the incense and the cold roads and the smell of October Castile is very clear. Possibly clearer than it should be. Possibly you have returned to it so many times in the long quiet years that it has taken on the quality of a kept thing, polished by handling. You keep it. That's all you can do with certain things. Keep them. On the 3rd of April, 1555, you have been at Tordesillas for 49 years. Philip the Handsome has been dead for 49 years. You are 75 years old, which is very old for the 16th century. Very old for anyone. A fact that surprises you somewhat, because aging has always seemed like something that happened to people who had time for it. The sisters who attend you are all different from the sisters who were here when you arrived. Everyone you knew when you arrived. Ferdinand, Cisneros, Fonseca, the envoys and advisers and careful men, they're gone. Maria de Ulloa died 15 years ago. Charles is somewhere in his empire, probably fighting something, probably winning. Your grandchildren are growing up in courts across Europe. The world has turned over entirely several times since a 17-year-old crossed the Bay of Biscay in a storm thinking about the man she was sailing toward. You're lying in your bed in the convent infirmary. The bed is warmer than the one in your cell. They moved you here 2 weeks ago when it became clear that the staying was ending. Your hands lie still on the wool blanket, not trembling today. The sister sitting with you is very young, new, recently arrived. She doesn't know the stories that older sisters know, hasn't had time to develop the particular careful caution that everyone who knows the stories develops around you. She just sits and reads her breviary and occasionally looks up with the uncomplicated attention of someone who is simply present. You look at the ceiling, stone, dark with smoke and age, the same stone that has been above you for 49 years. You've spent enough time looking at it to know every crack, every variation in the colour, every place where the mortar has settled. It's not an interesting ceiling, but it's yours. Through the window, small, set high in the thick wall, looking out at the Duero and the sky above it, the light is doing something extraordinary. April in Castile, late afternoon, the light, that particular gold that comes before evening, the kind of light that makes everything look more permanent than it is. You think about Philip, not the convoy Philip, not the coffin, but the Philip from before, across the hall, that forward, interested look. You've thought about him every day for 49 years, not always in grief. That's the thing that would have surprised the people who called it madness, the people who thought grief was the beginning and end of the story. Grief was part of it. But grief is not the only way to think about someone you loved. There's also gratitude for specific things, specific moments that the rest of it didn't erase. There's also anger for other things, which never entirely resolves but changes colour over time, becomes something cooler, something more structural, less a feeling and more an understanding. And there is, underneath all of it, the simple fact of the connection itself. 10 years, 6 children. The Bay of Biscay and the storm and the harbour in winter and the hall and that look, that was real. Whatever else is true about the story, whatever the verdict of history is on Joanna the Mad, that was real. You close your eyes. The sister reads her breviary. The light shifts. The way light shifts at that hour. The gold deepening, the room going dimmer without losing warmth. The monks who prayed over Philip's coffin are all dead, have been dead for decades. But somewhere in the convent chapel, the sisters are singing the evening office, Vespers, the prayer for the end of the day, the Latin rising and falling in the cold stone spaces the way it has been rising and falling in this country for 1,000 years. You hear it faintly through the walls. It sounds for a moment the way it sounded in the nave of Santa Clara in Burgos, in those early mornings before the journey, when the monks sang and the incense coiled and the candles burned and you sat on your low stool and kept company with the dead. It sounds like that, or something close to it. Memory, doing its polishing work. You breathe out. The centuries ahead of this moment will argue about you. The historians will write their versions. The tragic queen, the mad queen, the victim queen, the romantic queen, the politically manipulated queen, the queen who was actually quite sane if you think about it carefully, the queen who was genuinely unwell, and that's okay. Actually, mental illness isn't a shameful thing. Each generation will find the Joanna they need for their purposes, the one that proves the point they're already trying to prove, and each of those Joannas will contain approximately this much truth. Some. The actual truth is this. You were a woman in the 16th century who loved someone who didn't love her back properly, who inherited the most powerful kingdom in Europe, at a moment when the world was not prepared to be governed by a woman, who fought her father and her son, and the entire machinery of Castilian politics with the tools she had, which were limited, and who lost slowly and without ever quite accepting it, over the course of 49 years, and who kept, through all of it, the practice of paying attention, the letter writing, the political intelligence, the long game of knowing more than anyone expected her to know, who sat in a cold convent and never entirely gave up on the question of what was happening in Castile, even when Castile had given up on her. That's not madness. That's stubbornness. That's survival. That's the particular refusal of a woman who was told repeatedly and from every direction what she was, and who never entirely stopped maintaining her own version of the answer. Outside, the Duero moves. It has been moving since before the convent existed. It will continue moving long after every name in this story is forgotten. Rivers are like that. They don't negotiate. They don't manage. They just go. The light is almost gone. The sister is still reading. The chanting comes through the walls, thin and clear and older than any country. You are warm enough. You are tired enough. You are here, which is to say that you are yourself, in this body, on this April evening, which is also the only place you have ever been. The stone above you is the colour of ash. The blanket is rough wool and very heavy, in the way that good dense wool is heavy, not unpleasantly, the weight of it a kind of anchor, a kind of presence. Your hands are still. You have been still before, in Burgos, in the nave of Santa Clara, on the stool next to the coffin, the monks chanting and the candles burning and the smell of frankincense covering everything else. You have been still before and let the world continue around you. Let the prayers happen. Let the light move. Let time do what time does. It's easier this time. Maybe it's always easier the more you've practiced it. The door to the infirmary opens slightly, and the young sister glances up and then back down at her breviary, meaning nothing important. Just the house settling. Just the evening beginning. Somewhere in the world that exists beyond these walls, Charles is managing his empire. Your grandchildren are growing up in the courts of Europe, speaking languages you might not understand, navigating politics shaped partly by things you set in motion, and partly by things set in motion without you. The new world your mother funded is 3 continents now, enormous and strange, with a history being made in it that nobody in 1492 could have imagined. Philip the Handsome is in Granada, in the royal chapel, alongside Isabella, where you asked, where Ferdinand said, where eventually it happened. You got that one right. The chanting continues. The light continues to change. You breathe in and out, the simple rhythm of it. The one thing that doesn't require any decision or any performance or any management. In and out. The stone walls of Tordesillas are 3 feet thick at their narrowest. They've been here for 200 years and will be here for centuries more. Beyond them, the April Castile spreads, the plateau, the dry grass already showing green at the edges, the big sky, the enormous and indifferent sky, the same sky that was above the road between Burgos and Tordesillas, when the convoy moved through the dark and the monks chanted and the horses found the packed earth with reliable certainty. Forward, south, toward the place where queens are buried. You've been waiting to go there for 49 years. Patience, then. Patience has never been your strongest quality. But you've had 49 years of practice. You've gotten better at it. The chanting, the light, the warm weight of the wool, the sister turning a page. Let it come. Let the evening come and the night come after it and the long dark that comes after that. You've been in darker nights than this and found the morning. And if the morning that comes next is a different kind of morning, one that doesn't require getting up, one that doesn't require the careful performance of continued existence in a stone room, in a town on a river in a country that was yours, then that's all right too. You're tired enough, warm enough, done enough, you've earned the rest. The chanting fills the walls and settles in the corners, the way the monks' voices always filled spaces, completely, without gaps. You close your eyes. The last thing you're aware of is the sound of the vespers through the stone. The old words, older than any of the kingdoms involved in this story, older than Spain, older than the question of who governs what. Nunc dimittis servum tuum, Domine. Now let your servant depart in peace, Lord. The words filling the infirmary and the courtyard and the river and the plateau and the April sky. Secundum verbum tuum in pace. According to your word, in peace. The sister turns a page, the Duero moves, the light is gone. Joanna of Castile, called the Mad, Queen of Castile and Aragon and Granada, died on April 3rd, 1555. She was 75 years old. She'd been at Tordesillas for 49 years. Philip's remains were moved to the Escorial in 1574 by their son Philip II, who built the great monastery palace partly as a mausoleum for his parents. Philip the Handsome and Joanna of Castile lie there still, together in the basilica, in a vault beneath the altar. They got there eventually. Things take longer than they should sometimes. That's not the same as not arriving. Centuries have passed since the convoy moved through the Castilian dark, with the monks chanting and the torches and the November cold. The roads are different now, paved, lit, carrying machines instead of carts. The monasteries are different. Most of them converted into other things or maintained as museums. The stones that witnessed the praying absorbed into contexts their builders couldn't have imagined. The plateau is the same. That enormous, patient, dry sky is the same. The light in October, brilliant and clear and cutting. the cold that settles into stone and stays, the rivers moving through the landscape with no particular interest in the human events that take place along their banks. People still live in Castile, still work there, still fall asleep at night in the cold with the weight of the day on them, and still wake in the morning to whatever the morning requires. Some of them know Joanna's name. Some have read the accounts, the contemporary ones that called her mad, that described her erratic behaviour, her refusal to cooperate, her obsessive grief. Some have read the later accounts, the revisionist ones, the feminist rereadings, the historical reassessments that arrived in the 20th century and are still arriving. Most of them, honestly, know mainly the image. A woman, dark dress, a coffin, candles, Spain. That image is enough. Because what that image carries, if you look at it long enough, if you stop looking at it as evidence of madness and start looking at it as what it actually is a woman doing the thing that she had the authority to do, the last thing she could control in a situation she'd been steadily losing control of for years. She was keeping company with the dead. She was refusing to be managed into the kind of grief that's convenient for everyone watching. She was a queen who loved a man who didn't love her back, and she carried that love further than decorum permitted, further than politics permitted, further than her own father's kingdom permitted, and she did it in public, on the roads of Castile, with 12 monks chanting and the November cold in her bones and the smell of incense rising in the dark. There are worse ways to use whatever authority remains to you. There are worse things to refuse. So wherever you are right now, whatever bed, whatever room, whatever the weight of the day has been, know that Joanna of Castile lay down one April evening in a stone room in Tordesillas, with the chanting coming through the walls, and the Duero moving outside and the April sky going dark, and she closed her eyes, and she was warm enough. But before all of that, before the coffin and the monks and the cold October roads, there was Flanders. And Flanders requires more than the summary it got. It requires the specific texture of what it was like to be 18 years old in a foreign court in a foreign country, married to a man who was beautiful in the way that storms are beautiful, which is to say with complete indifference to what the beauty does to the people watching it. Let's go back further. The ship that brought you from Spain to Flanders in 1496 left from Laredo, on the northern coast, and the departure was a ceremony. These things were always ceremonies. Your mother was there on the dock in the thin coastal light, and she looked at you in the way she had of looking at things that mattered, directly, without softness, but not without love. She was not a woman who cried at docks. She was not a woman who made goodbyes into theatre. She held your hands and said, "Remember what you are, not who, what. You were 17. You thought you understood the distinction. You didn't. Not yet. But you would." The ship was called the Santa Maria de la Antigua, which felt like an omen of some kind, the name of a virgin, the name of patience. It had been prepared with the specific, exhausting care that accompanies the transportation of a royal princess. Hangings in the cabin, provisions of a quality that the sailors themselves would not see, a small retinue of ladies and servants, and a priest who prayed without ceasing, his lips moving quietly even when he was eating, even when he was asleep, or so it seemed. The first 3 days were fine. The Bay of Biscay was doing nothing alarming. The water was a deep, serious blue, and the ship moved through it with the steady, purposeful motion of something that knows where it's going. Then the weather changed. It changed the way weather changes in the Bay of Biscay, which is to say without negotiation. One morning the sky was clear and the next morning it was not. And between those 2 mornings was a night that you will carry for the rest of your life. Not in the way that terrifying things are carried exactly, but in the way that revelatory things are carried. Things that showed you something true about yourself that you hadn't had occasion to test before. The ship moved in ways ships aren't supposed to move. Sideways almost. The angles were wrong. Everything that could slide, it was sliding. The wooden plates on the table, the books that had been wedged into corners, the priest crucifixes which came unhooked from the wall at 3 in the morning and hit the floor with a series of wooden thunks that punctuated the sound of the storm outside. Your ladies were sick, most of them. The particular misery of seasickness is that it is entirely physical and entirely consuming. It bypasses everything else, every priority, every social obligation. Your ladies, who were otherwise perfectly composed women who would die rather than appear undignified in front of the princess, were absolutely undignified, and would have continued to be undignified if the Empress of the Holy Roman Empire herself had walked into the cabin. You weren't sick. This surprised you. You'd expected to be. Everyone was, nearly everyone, and you had no particular reason to think your body would handle the motion better than theirs. But you sat in the swaying cabin with your back against the solid wall and your knees against your chest, and you thought, quite clearly, well, this is what a storm is, not fear, observation. The particular quality of attention that kicks in when the thing you've been warned about actually arrives and turns out to be real rather than a story. You went on deck. The ladies who were in no condition to stop you didn't. The deck was chaos, sailors running. Not in panic, in the controlled, urgent motion of people who know exactly what the chaos requires of them. Rain coming horizontal. The ship tilting at angles that made standing a negotiation, your feet finding the wood by intuition, your hands finding ropes without planning to. The sea around you was not the serious blue of the previous days. It was grey-green and enormous and deeply, completely, indifferently present. The waves higher than the ship's rail when they crested, the troughs between them dropping away into depths that had no interest in your survival. A sailor grabbed your arm, shouted something in the Basque dialect that was the language of this coast, which you didn't speak, whose meaning was clearly, go below. You looked at the storm, he shouted again. You stayed for another minute, just one, watching the water, feeling the rain, which was cold enough that it felt like impact rather than precipitation, each drop arriving like a small, insistent fact. Then you went below. The storm lasted 4 more days, and here is the thing you learned. You were not afraid of the storm, but you were afraid of Flanders. Not the country, not the people, not even Philip, whose beauty you'd been told about, and whose name you'd repeated to yourself in private like a word in a language you were trying to learn. Not afraid of those things. Afraid of who you would be in a different country. Afraid of the version of yourself that existed outside the Spain where you'd grown up. Outside the mother whose gravity had organised your world since you were born. Outside the language and the religion and the specific texture of Castilian air in autumn. Afraid of being unknown. That's the fear you don't hear about in the stories of royal marriages, not the political fear that you know about, that everyone knows about. The fear of self, of crossing an ocean and finding that the person you've been building for 17 years is contingent on the landscape you built it in. The ship found Flanders. Storms always end. The harbour came through grey mist on a morning that smelled of salt and low tide and something underneath. fish, old timber, the particular exhalation of a coast that has been a trading port for centuries, that has absorbed into its stones the smell of every cargo that has passed through it. They took you to the hall, and across the hall, Philip. You've thought about this moment so many times that the memory has been worked smooth. But there's something underneath the smooth version, something rougher, that the working hasn't entirely erased. Because the chest thing, the thing you couldn't name and still can't name exactly, it wasn't just attraction, it was recognition. Like seeing something you'd been looking for without knowing you were looking. Which was probably a lie your heart told your brain. The brain is susceptible to the heart's stories, especially at 17. But the recognition felt real. That's the thing. However wrong the interpretation, the feeling was real. Something in you registered something in him, and that registration happened before anything else. Before knowledge, before strategy, before the careful evaluation that being a princess had taught you to perform. You were surprised. You were not supposed to be surprised. You were supposed to be prepared. He said something in French. You answered. Something shifted in his expression. That was the beginning. What follows the beginning is harder. The first year of the marriage was something. Not what you expected, but then you hadn't expected anything precisely enough to be disappointed by the specifics. Philip was charming in the universal way, the way that charming people are charming to everyone, without hierarchy. He was charming to you the same way he was charming to the servants who brought his wine and the courtiers who flattered him, and the ladies who presented themselves to his attention, with the particular deliberate body language that is the same in every language, and that you learn to read very quickly. He was kind in his way, not cruel, not in the beginning. The cruelty was the absence of attention, which is a different kind. The kind that doesn't make marks you can point to, but makes marks anyway. He would be present for days at a time, genuinely present, asking questions about Spain, about your mother, about the things you'd read and thought about, listening with that forward, interested attention that you'd seen across the hall. In these periods you believed the thing you'd believed when you looked across the hall. You thought, here it is, here is what it is, and then he would be gone. Not physically. Physically he was at court, at dinners, at the ceremonies that fill the days of a person who rules a territory. But gone in the essential sense, the attention redirected, the forward lean turned elsewhere. The court knew. This is the part of the story that nobody who tells it simply calls it madness, adequately explains. The court knew, the ladies knew, the servants knew, the Flemish advisers and the French ambassadors and the German merchants who passed through the court on trade business. Everyone knew what Philip was and what the marriage was and what the gap was between the public version of events and the private one. Everyone knew, and nobody said so to you directly, because saying so directly would have been an offence against the husband who was their lord, and you were the wife from Spain who didn't have allies in this court, who hadn't grown up in this language, who had nobody to tell. You told your letters. This is documented, actually. The letters Joanna wrote from Flanders back to Spain, to her parents, to the advisers she'd grown up knowing. The letters describe in language that grows more distressed as the years pass what was happening. The loneliness, the jealousy, the specific pain of watching a husband move through a room with that forward, interested attention directed at someone who was not you. And the responses from Ferdinand especially, describe a concern for her mental state that grows in parallel with the distress in the letters. Each letter she wrote about something real was answered with a letter about whether she was all right. This is the machinery. This is how it works. A woman describes pain. The people receiving the description decide the pain itself is the problem, rather than the thing causing it. The woman's account of her own experience becomes, through this process, evidence against her. By the time you were 22, Ferdinand had twice suggested to Philip that Joanna was not entirely well. Philip had agreed, in letters, that he shared the concern. You kept writing the letters. What else do? You stop writing and the isolation is complete. No connection to Spain. No connection to your mother. No way to make what was happening to you visible to anyone who might help. You write, and the letters become evidence against you. You're caught in that particular trap. You think about this sometimes, in the convent at Tordesillas, in the long years. You think about the letters and whether there was another option you didn't see, something different you could have done. You can't find it. The storm was bad and the options were all the same options. What you had instead of options was yourself, the Philip who fell in love with his own legend and forgot to check whether the legend was accurate. The Joanna who was never going to perform being a simpler person than she was, even when that simplicity would have been safer. 2 people, 1 marriage. The math was not going to work, but you tried. You're clear about this. In the Tordesillas years, whatever else you revise, you don't revise that. You tried. Not as a failure trying, not as someone who'd already accepted the outcome, but as someone who genuinely believed that trying was meaningful and that things could be different, and that the man who looked at you with that particular attention across a hall in Flanders was in there somewhere and could be reached if you were patient enough or honest enough, or some combination of qualities you were always just slightly failing to identify. The children came. Isabel, born 1501, who lived only a few hours. Then Charles, born 1500, whom you barely saw because he was placed immediately in the care of Flemish tutors. Then Isabella, Fernanda, Maria. Then Catherine, the youngest, born in Torquemada in 1507, after Philip died, after everything, a baby born into a world already fundamentally changed. Each pregnancy was its own country. The physical transformation of it, the heaviness, the nausea, the way your body became something you were consulting rather than inhabiting, a thing with its own agenda and its own timeline, the colder Flemish winters while pregnant, the particular discomfort of formal dress against a body that was reorganizing itself around a new passenger. Philip was attentive during some of the pregnancies. This you hold honestly. He was not absent. He would come back from wherever he'd been, and there would be a period of genuine presence, sitting with you in the evenings, asking about how you felt, occasionally placing his hand flat on your belly with an expression that was, you thought, real. Whatever complicated thing he felt about you, and it was complicated, you know that now. He was not indifferent to the children. He was not indifferent to you exactly either. That's the part that's hardest to hold. Indifference would have been cleaner. What Philip had for you was something more ambiguous, a kind of regard that coexisted with his other choices without apparent contradiction, the way people hold contradictory things when they've decided not to examine them too closely. You examined things too closely. That was always your problem, if it was a problem, which you're not sure it was. You examined things because examining them was how you understood them, and understanding them was the only tool you had for navigating them. Philip found this tiring, probably. You found a great many things about Philip tiring. You loved him anyway. The love was not the simple, warm thing that the ballads describe. It had splinters in it. It had the specific weight of sustained disappointment, which is different from despair. Despair is the end of expectation, but disappointment requires expectation to survive, requires the ongoing belief that things could be otherwise, and that belief is both its own torture and its own strange sustenance. You expected better from him. You expected this until he was dead. And after he was dead, you expected it still, in the way you expect things from people who are no longer there to deliver them. Not as belief exactly, but as the shape of absence, as the specific profile of what the loss has the outline of. This is what the convoy was about. Not madness, not denial, the continuation, by the only means remaining, of the effort to give him what he should have had, the proper honour, the continuous prayer, the escort of a queen, the thing he deserved as a king and as a husband and as the father of her children, the thing she could give him now that she could not give him while he was alive, because while he was alive he kept moving, kept leaving, kept removing himself from the place where giving was possible. Now he couldn't leave. The convoy moved. The monks chanted. The incense burned. You gave him the gift he couldn't accept while he was alive. Your full and undivided attention, for as long as it took. On the fourth day of the journey, there is a moment that nobody records, but that you remember with the particular clarity of things experienced alone. The convoy has stopped for the midday rest. The horses need water. The monks need water. Everyone needs water and bread and a chance to sit rather than ride. You've pulled off the road into the yard of a small farm whose owner, an elderly man with the wind-burned face of someone who's worked this land for 50 years, has agreed to let the convoy use his well. The coffin cart is stopped in the yard. The monks are resting, still chanting, but seated. The continuous prayer continuing even when the physical movement pauses. The ladies are inside the farmhouse with the farmer's wife, who produced bread and hard cheese with the matter-of-fact hospitality of someone who feeds large groups as a matter of course. You're alone in the yard. Not alone. Maria is nearby, and a guard by the gate, and the monks around the cart. But alone in the sense that nobody is requiring anything of you for this specific moment, which is rarer than it sounds. You walk to the well. The stone of the well coping is cold under your palms when you rest them on it, and look down into the dark. The water is a long way down. You can see the glint of it. Faint, a small circle of reflected sky at the bottom of a stone cylinder. The smell coming up from it is mineral and deep. The smell of cold places underground, of water that has never seen the sun. You drop a small stone. Listen. The sound of it hitting the water comes up after a pause that tells you the distance. Far, very far down. You think about Philip. Not the Philip of the last months. The Philip who played polo and died in 6 days. The Philip from before all of it. The Philip at the beginning. The one across the hall. You try to remember him as he was then, before the years of disappointment added their layers, before grief added its particular distortions. You remember, he was curious. This is the thing that's hardest to hold on to, because the cruelty of his absence makes curiosity a bitter quality to remember. But it was real. He was genuinely interested in things, in ideas, in the politics of Europe, which he had a quick, intuitive mind for, not disciplined, not scholarly, but fast. He could see a situation structure in a way that more patient minds sometimes missed. He was interested in you once, in the specific texture of who you were, the Spanish girl who answered his French without waiting for a translator, who stood on a ship deck in a storm, who argued theology with her chaplain in the mornings and rode better than most of his courtiers in the afternoons. That interest faded, but it was there. It was real. You stand at the well and hold that real thing. The water far below holds the small circle of sky. A sparrow lands on the coping 2 feet from your hand, tips its head, assesses you with one eye, and then lifts and is gone. The monks chant. The farm smells of animals and hay, and the particular dusty sweetness of the plateau in late October, the smell of the year finishing, of things completing the cycle they started in spring. You breathe it in, hold it, let it go. Your Majesty. Maria, from behind you. We should continue. Yes, you say. You take your hands off the well coping. The stone's cold stays in your palms for a moment, then fades. The convoy moves. The confrontation with Ferdinand on the road at Aranda de Duero is a thing you play back afterward, looking for the moment where you might have played it differently, the moment where a different choice led to a different outcome. You play it back many times over the years at Tordesillas, in the long evenings, when the mind goes looking for alternate histories the way the tongue goes looking for a loose tooth. You can't find the different moment. Ferdinand came with 20 riders and the legal weight of a regency, and the political machinery of Aragon behind him. You came with 12 carts and 12 monks, and Maria and 40 people, making their way slowly south across the plateau. The asymmetry was always there. The difference in resources was always there. What you had was the specific technical fact of still being the queen. A queen in transit, technically on royal business, technically exercising her authority over her husband's remains. A queen whose designation as incapable had not yet been formally completed, because formally completing it required someone to state publicly what they were doing, and publicly stating it was a different and more dangerous thing than merely arranging it. You used the gap between the arrangement and the statement. Not cleverly enough, not enough, but as much as you could. When Ferdinand's rider appeared on the horizon ahead of the convoy, you were riding alongside the coffin cart in the October light, watching the plateau spread around you in all directions. The rider came from the north at speed, slowing as he approached, and even at distance you could read his posture, the forward lean of someone carrying news that has weight to it, the particular set of a man who's been riding hard and is now performing the deceleration of having arrived. He came to Maria first, not you, which told you something. Ferdinand's people knew who actually managed your information. Maria came to your side. 20 riders, she said. Your father, about 3 miles behind the advance rider. You kept looking at the plateau. Is there a faster road south from here, you asked? Not one the carts can manage, Maria said. The monks? They'd keep up. You thought about it. 3 miles, 20 riders. The lead cart with the coffin, which could not go fast, had never gone fast, was built for the long journey rather than the sprint. We wait, you said. Maria absorbed this without visible reaction. If we wait, she said carefully, he arrives with more authority than he'd have if we were still moving. If we run, you said, we confirm what he's already told the council, that we're not fit to be making decisions. A pause. We wait, you said again. The convoy came to a natural stop near a crossing where 2 roads met. A small stone cross marking the junction, in the way that small stone crosses mark junctions all over the Castilian plateau, put there by someone long dead for reasons that have mostly been absorbed by time. You dismounted, stretched your back, which had been aching since the morning's ride. The pain was specific and low, the kind that riding produces in women's bodies, Something about the angle of the saddle on a horse that was not entirely the right size for you. You walked to the coffin cart and rested your hand on it. The monks looked at you from around the cart, some of them with the expression of men who understood in outline that something was happening that was larger than a funeral procession. Continue, you told them. They continued. Ferdinand arrived on a horse that was lathered from the fast ride, not desperately but noticeably. 20 men behind him spread out across the road in a formation that was not quite military, but carried the echo of military thinking, the show of numbers as argument. He pulled up 20 feet away. You waited, with your hand on the coffin cart and your back to him for a moment before you turned. In that moment of turning, the moment between not having met his eyes and meeting them, you understand something. You understand that you've been losing this fight since before Philip died, since before Spain, since before Flanders. You've been losing it since the day you were born in a century that was going to spend the next 500 years arguing about who you were, and whatever the argument produced was never going to be the version you would have recognised. You turn. "Father," you say. He looks at you and you look at him, and between you is 47 years of being related to each other, which is its own country, its own language, its own history that neither of you chose and neither of you can exit. "Joanna," he says, the monks chant. There is a particular quality of autumn light in Castile. You've mentioned this before, but it's worth returning to, because the day of the confrontation with Ferdinand had it more completely than most days. The quality that makes everything look like it's about to be final. Not threatening, not ominous, just final. The way the year looks when it knows it's ending. The plateau stretched around both of you in all directions, the dry grass catching the light along each stalk individually. The kind of detail that the eye picks out when the mind is very clear and very still. A hawk circled somewhere overhead, too high to be focused on anything at ground level. The small stone cross at the junction caught its shadow. Ferdinand dismounted. He walked toward you, and you stayed where you were, next to the cart, and the monks chanted between you. "This journey," Ferdinand said, stopping at a distance that was close but not intimate, the distance of authority trying to be paternal, cannot continue. "It continues," you said, "until Granada. The council acts in my name," you said, "not in place of it. My name means something. I'm standing on a road in Castile in November, not lying in bed in Burgos. I am present. I am capable. The council should not require more than that." He looked at you for a long moment. Ferdinand of Aragon, who negotiated the marriage of Ferdinand and Isabella against enormous resistance, who managed the politics of the Spanish kingdoms for 40 years, with a precision that historians would still be praising 500 years later, who was, by most accounts, one of the most effective political minds of his century, who was looking at his daughter on a road in Castile and losing. Not permanently. He knew that. In the long view, he had resources, and she had stubbornness, and resources outlast stubbornness in most configurations. But in this moment, on this road, with 40 witnesses and the monks chanting and the coffin cart between them, in this moment, she had him. Because the only way to stop her here, right now, was to use force. And using force against your daughter, the Queen of Castile, in public, on a road, with 40 witnesses, that was not a calculation that worked. It produced consequences. It produced talk. It established in living memory, and in every letter that would be written about this day, that Ferdinand of Aragon had his daughter physically removed from the road. He wouldn't do it. Not today. "The remains will go to Granada," he said. "Thank you," you said. The negotiation was over. Everything else, Tordesillas, the regency, the management that was already arranged and only awaiting formalization, all of that was still coming. You knew it was coming. But it was coming later, after the coffin reached Granada, and later was not now. The convoy moved. Ferdinand rode beside you and said nothing for a very long time, and the monks chanted between you, and the plateau received all of it with complete equanimity. At Tordesillas, the first months are the worst, not because the sisters are unkind, they're not. Not because the physical conditions are terrible. They're uncomfortable, the cold and the stone and the plain food and the narrow bed, but they're the conditions of a religious house, and they have a certain austerity that is at least honest. Not even because you're confined. The confinement is real, but the convent has gardens, has the river within view, has the basic movements of a day within walls. The worst part is the silence. Not literal silence. The convent is full of the specific sounds of a functioning religious community, the bells, the offices, the soft movement of sisters through stone corridors, the kitchen sounds, the chapel sounds, but the silence of being removed from the world's information, the silence of dispatches not arriving, of reports not being made, of the kingdom continuing without you as its organizing reference point. You were raised to be the reference point. Your whole formation, every lesson, every prayer, every carefully supervised interaction was oriented toward the moment when Castile required a queen, and you would be that queen. And now Castile is being run by your father's regency councils, and they are doing so in your name, signing documents, Joanna of Castile, and you are at Tordesillas where you know nothing. This is deliberate. Of course it is. The less you know, the harder it is to act. You address it systematically, in the way your mother would have addressed it. First, the sisters. You spend 3 weeks simply being present with the sisters, attending the offices, working in the garden when the weather allows, learning their names and their histories and the specific texture of who they are. This is not strategy exactly. This is also just good sense. These women are your community now, whether either party chose it or not, and living in a community requires knowing the community. What you discover, they are not your enemies. Some of them are Ferdinand's instruments. The abbess, Sor Pilar, is a competent woman who has received instructions and follows them with the brisk efficiency of someone who understands that her house's continued royal patronage depends on cooperation. But she's not cruel. She distinguishes between the instructions she's received, which are primarily about limiting certain kinds of access, and the human being in her care, who is a queen but also a woman, who is grieving but also functional, who needs containment only in the specific political sense, and not in the sense of being someone who requires management for her own safety. Sor Pilar makes this distinction quietly, consistently, and without acknowledgement. You make the same distinction in how you treat her. This is an equilibrium. It's not friendship exactly, and it's not compliance exactly. It's two intelligent women in a constrained situation doing what can be done. Within the space Sor Pilar leaves, and she leaves more space than Ferdinand intended, which you don't comment on, you build the information network that Maria supplies through this girl from the town. It's slow work. Slower than anything you've done before. The letters take days to arrive and days to respond to, and by the time you receive news, it's old news, the situation already shifted. You learn to read further ahead, not just what is happening, but what is likely to happen based on what has happened. The pattern rather than the point. You become At Tordesillas, the political thinker, you never had the opportunity to fully be before. This is the irony of it. The imprisonment that was supposed to remove you from governance produces, in the long years, a Joanna who understands Castile more deeply than the governors who claim to be acting in her name. Because you have time. You have nothing but time. And time, combined with the intelligence and access, even limited access, is a formidable tool. Ferdinand figures this out eventually. He visits Tordesillas twice in the last years of his life. The visits are short and carefully managed. He comes with a specific agenda, addresses it, and leaves. But even in those short visits you can see him recalculating, looking at his daughter in the convent parlour and finding someone unexpected. He doesn't say this. Ferdinand says very little of what he actually thinks. But you're his daughter. You learned to read that face before you could read a page. He's surprised. He expected the grief to have finished you in some more thorough way. Expected the isolation to have produced a more passive, more accommodating woman. What he finds is someone who asks, in their second meeting, very specific questions about the grain prices in Andalusia and the reasons for the recent decision about the port tariffs in Seville. Questions that could only come from someone who'd been receiving and analysing information for years. He doesn't ask where she got it. He answers the questions. Something between them in those last years is almost, not quite, but almost, the relationship it might have been. The father and daughter who could have governed Castile together, who had the same quick mind and the same instinct for the structure of situations, who disagreed about almost everything fundamental, but could at least discuss the practical matters with a shared vocabulary. Almost. Then he dies, and Charles comes, and the world turns again. The Comuneros revolt deserves more than it usually gets in Joanna's story, which tends to treat it as a subplot, the moment when the Mad Queen surprised everyone by refusing to help the rebels. But it's not a subplot. It's the clearest demonstration of what Joanna actually was, which is not a grieving widow, and not a broken queen, and not a convenient prop for anyone's agenda. It's January 1521. You've been at Tordesillas for 15 years. The revolt has been building for 2 years. The towns of Castile rising against a king who doesn't speak their language, whose Flemish advisers are bleeding the kingdom, who seems to understand himself as the emperor first, and the king of Castile considerably later. Padilla and his rebels take Tordesillas in August, not violently, more like a political occupation. They've brought an army, but they present themselves to you as petitioners. They want your signature. They want you to legitimize the revolt with the authority of the rightful queen, which is you, which has always been you. You sit with Padilla for 2 hours. He's a young man, 31, which is young enough that his conviction still has the quality of being unqualified. He speaks in the cadences of someone who's been rehearsing this speech for months, who has thought through every objection and prepared every response. He is articulate and passionate and not stupid, which makes him more difficult than a simple petitioner. He tells you what they want. Legitimate grievances genuinely. The removal of foreign advisers, the restoration of the traditional rights of the Castilian cities, the recognition of the Cortes as a meaningful body with actual power. You listen. He tells you that you are the true queen, that the regency is illegal, that your signature would right 15 years of wrong. You listen to this too. Then you ask him several questions. You ask about his military position, how many men, how well supplied, what his assessment is of Charles's likely response. You ask about the other town leaders in the revolt, whether they agree on the agenda, or whether there are divisions he's managing. You ask about Portugal, whether the Portuguese crown has been approached and what the response was. His answers, and the way he gives them, tell you what you need to know. He has enough men for a campaign if Charles is slow to respond. He doesn't have enough men if Charles responds quickly. There are divisions among the rebel leaders, significant ones, over both strategy and the nature of what they want. Portugal has given no commitment. You think about this, then you say no. The look on his face. It's the look of a man who prepared for every argument except the one where you simply know more than he does about the situation he's in. Your Majesty, he says, you have been imprisoned here. I have been resident here, you say. There's a distinction. Your father. My father is dead, you say. My son governs in my name. The question of whether the arrangement is ideal is separate from the question of whether replacing it with a revolt that has a 50% chance of failure is better. A revolt that would free. A revolt that would put my name on a civil war, you say. A revolt that, if it fails, and I assess it, has a reasonable chance of failing, brands everyone associated with it a traitor, including me. He stares at you. And if it succeeds, you continue, I emerge from Tordesillas as the figurehead of a movement that wants to govern in my name, which is functionally identical to being governed in my name by my father's people, except that your movement is less stable and less experienced. A very long silence. You've thought about this, Padilla says finally. I've had 15 years, you say. He leaves without your signature. The revolt fails 18 months later, as you assessed it probably would. Padilla is captured and executed at Vilalá in April 1521. The other leaders similarly. You spend several days thinking about the young man, about the rightness of his cause and the wrongness of his position, about how often those two things exist simultaneously, and how rarely anyone who's in the rightness is able to see the wrongness clearly enough to adjust. You were never able to adjust yourself. In Flanders, in the early years, you saw the situation clearly, the isolation, the managed correspondence, the way your grief was being used, and seeing it clearly didn't help you. Knowing something is true and being able to act on that knowledge are separate skills, and Joanna of Castile has spent her life in the gap between them. At least she sees the gap. At least she's never made the mistake of thinking the seeing was enough. Charles returns twice more in the years before your health begins to decline. The second visit is different from the first. He comes not with specific business to conduct, but more in the manner of a son who has finally understood that time is not unlimited. He is older now, the seriousness more settled into his face. He's been at war more or less continuously for 20 years. He has fought the French and the Turks and the Pope and Martin Luther, the last of which is giving him the most sustained trouble. This priest from Germany, who has attached a set of grievances to a church door and set half of Europe on fire with them. You talk about Luther. This surprises him. He expected to manage the conversation, to be the one bringing information, the one contextualizing events. Instead, you ask questions that reveal you've been following the German situation for years, through Maria's network, through letters, through the particular attention of someone with nothing to do but read and think. You have thoughts about Luther, not sympathetic ones exactly. You are your mother's daughter. You are constitutionally orthodox. The idea of splintering the church appalls you in the specific way that anything that introduces division appalls someone who has spent her life watching what division does to people and kingdoms. But you have thoughts about why Luther happened, about the specific failures of the church that created the space for Luther to inhabit, about the corruption that your mother spent years trying to address through Cisneros, and the ways in which the addressing was insufficient. Charles listens to all of this with the specific quality of listening that you've come to identify as genuine in him. He does that, your son. He learned it young, probably from necessity, in a court where everyone was always telling him what they wanted him to hear. He learned to hear what was underneath. He has Philip's eyes and your attention. The combination is formidable, and you hope he's using it well. You should have governed, he says in that last visit, which echoes the first. Probably, you say, though I've wondered sometimes whether what I would have done is better than what actually happened. It's impossible to calculate. Your mother My mother would have been a different queen than I would have been, you say. She was formed by fighting for her throne in a way I wasn't. Her certainty was earned in battle. Mine was theoretical. He's quiet. It wasn't only the grief, he says carefully. The stories they told about you. No, you agree. The grief was useful. It made a more sympathetic story than the truth, which is that I was a woman who refused to be managed, and that's not a story that recommends itself. He looks out the window at the Duero. I'm sorry, he says, which is the most direct thing he has ever said to you. You look at him, your firstborn, the one you barely knew as a child, the one who grew up in Flanders while you were in Spain, who became the emperor you watched from a stone room in Tordesillas, the one who has Philip's eyes. You were a boy, you say. You inherited a situation. You managed it according to your advisor's recommendations, which were that I was unstable and needed containment. Those recommendations came from people who had spent 15 years establishing that as fact. I should have investigated further. Yes, you say, you should have. A pause. You forgive me anyway, he says. Not a question. He's reading you the way you've always been read by the people who are paying attention. I'm your mother, you say. That's a different category from forgiving. He nods. The sisters bring wine. You sit with your son in the convent parlour as the afternoon light crosses the floor in the slow way that afternoon light crosses floors, and you talk about the grandchildren who are growing up in courts across Europe and becoming the people they'll be for the rest of their lives, which are already underway without you. This is the life that happens instead of the one that didn't. Not worse, exactly, different, constrained in specific ways and free in others. The freedom that comes from no longer having to perform anything for anyone, from being so thoroughly off the stage that the stage has forgotten to watch. You pray, still. Read when your eyes allow it, which they allow less as the years pass, the small print blurring into suggestion. You grow things in the convent garden, which gives you the specific satisfaction of watching processes that have their own logic and their own timeline and don't require your management. Tomatoes, lavender. A small fig tree that took 4 years to produce figs but eventually did, dark and sweet, splitting open on the branch in September heat with a kind of luxurious patience that you find, if not inspirational, at least companionable. The river below the convent walls runs through all of it. You've watched it in all its seasons. Winter grey and deliberate, spring turbulent with snowmelt from the mountains, summer low and flashing in the hot light, autumn reflective, holding the colours of the trees on its banks in perfect temporary images. You've found, in the years of watching the river, that rivers are better companions than most people give them credit for being. They don't require conversation. They don't need management. They just move, according to their own understanding of what moving means, which is considerable. The monks who travelled with Philip's convoy to Granada, you think about them sometimes. The 12 who maintained the continuous prayer through the journey, who sang through the confrontation with Ferdinand and through the cold nights and through the mud and the wheel problems and all of it. Most of them must be dead by now. Old men when you travelled, middle-aged, even the youngest. But the prayers are still happening, presumably somewhere. The offices are still being sung. The continuous liturgical life of the church, which has been running for 1500 years, continues to run through individual lives the way a river runs through individual landscapes, present in each, defined by none. You take comfort in this, not in the way that comfort is usually offered to grieving people, not as the softening of loss, as a structural observation, as the same thing you noticed about the Duero watching it for 49 years, which is that things continue. Things continue. Philip is in Granada, in the chapel, in the dark beneath the altar where the cold of the stone floor has been cold for 500 years and will continue to be cold for 500 more. You'll be there, eventually. That's right. That's how it should end. Everything south. Everything to its proper place. Now the light is going. Now the evening is coming through the window where you've spent 49 years watching the Duero turn through its seasons. Now the chanting is coming through the walls. The sisters singing the Vespers the way they've sung them every evening since before you were born. The Latin moving through the stone like water moves through stone, finding the small passages, making itself a home. Let it. Let the evening come the way evenings have always come at Tordesillas. First the light going, then the chill in the air, then the smells of the kitchen preparing supper, bread and beans, and the simple, honest smell of food being made for people who are hungry. You are not afraid. This is worth saying again, because it's true, and because the story of Joanna is told so often as a story of damage that the lack of fear at the end of it might seem inconsistent. But fear requires something at stake that might be lost, and you have been living for 49 years in the condition of having already lost the things that could be lost. What remains is not subject to loss. What remains is you. The specific texture of your attention, the way your mind moves through a problem, the prayers you've been saying since childhood, worn smooth by repetition into something that requires less energy and produces more warmth, the way well-handled things do. The love that had nowhere to go after Philip died and went everywhere instead. Into the kingdom you paid attention to from a distance, into the children you watched become strangers, into the convent garden where the fig tree took 4 years to fruit, into the river that never stopped moving, into the long dark of Tordesillas where you read and thought and prayed and waited. It went somewhere. It always goes somewhere. Even the love that looks like madness from the outside is going somewhere. Even the convoy on the cold road in October, the monks chanting and the incense rising and the coffin draped in black velvet, and the queen riding alongside it in the pre-dawn dark, because she couldn't bear to leave him in Burgos while her father arranged her future. Even that was love going somewhere. It was going to Granada. It got there. The fig tree fruits in September. The river runs in all seasons. The Vespers are sung at evening in the chapel of the convent of Santa Clara in Tordesillas, the small city on the Duero, in the kingdom of Castile, in the country that is not finished becoming what it is. Let all of it be there. Let the world continue its enormous, complex, indifferent business. Let the monks chant somewhere, the officers running through the night the way they always have, the sound of it coming through stone walls and into the room where you're lying in the gathering dark, breathing, just breathing in and out. The blanket is heavy wool, the kind that holds warmth after you stop generating it, the kind that says, "Rest now, I've got this." Your hands are still. The tremor that came in the late years is absent tonight. Your hands lie flat on the blanket as though they've decided to be simply hands, without a gender. You were warm enough. You had the river and the fig tree and the girl who carried the letters and the sisters who knew when to look away, and the sun who came and listened in the long practice of praying in the dark. You had Philip across the hall, that was real. You had a storm in the Bay of Biscay and the deck tilting and the sailors on their knees and you, 17 years old, standing at the rail looking at the enormous indifferent sea and feeling, against all reasonable expectation, something like gladness. That was real too. The gladness and the storm and the sea, all of it. Let your thoughts slow now. Let the distinctions between things soften at the edges, the way they do when the body is finally done with the day and the mind follows. Let Flanders go. Let the road between Burgos and Tordesillas go. Let the coffin cart and the monks and the October light go. They've been where they needed to go. They did what they needed to do. Let the years of Tordesillas settle into something quieter than years. The river, the garden, the vespers, the letters, the long practice of paying attention. Let that be enough. It is enough. The night is here. The stars are over Castile, the same stars that were over the Bay of Biscay when you were 17, and over the road when the convoy moved through the dark, and over the convent since the convent began. The same stars that were over Granada when Philip's coffin arrived. The same stars that will be over all of it when the names are forgotten, and the buildings have become their ruins, and the Duero is still running through whatever landscape comes next. The human heart, the need to love something, the need to be loyal to it past the point of convenience, past the point of what anyone else thinks is reasonable, past the point of your own safety. That doesn't change. It won't change. It's changing nothing right now in the room where you are, reading this, listening to this, in whatever place and whatever year you find yourself. The need to love something, and to keep loving it, and to refuse the version of you that stops. That's Joanna. That's everyone. A little. Let sleep take you the way it took her. Not with violence, not with drama, but with the quiet certainty of something that has been waiting its turn with enormous patience, that knows you'll get there, that is already right here at the edge of the next breath. Let the sound of the vespers come through whatever walls stand between you and the rest of the world. Let the river run. Let the fig tree hold its fruit in the dark. Let the October light on the plateau, brilliant and exact, land on the dry grass and the packed earth, and the wheel tracks of a convoy long since arrived. You've been paying attention for a long time. You can rest now. The stars have got the rest of it. Good night.